Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 3 more recently solved cold cases. Let's get into it. Number 3. Marianne Bagginstose. It was on June 5, 1984 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania when 25-year-old Marianne Bagginstose disappeared forever, leaving her son, her home, and her family to wonder what had happened to her. Marianne had recently separated from her husband, Jerry Bagginstose. The two had mostly concluded a lengthy custody battle over their only child together, and the last court date was to finalize child support payments for Marianne, who had been awarded primary custody. Also in the separation, Marianne stayed in the family home, while her estranged husband moved back in with his parents. To pay the bills, Marianne also got a boarder. On the morning of her disappearance, the only person to see her that morning was Jerry, her estranged husband. He would later tell the detectives that he'd gone over to the house to take Marianne to a car dealership to trade in her vehicle. However, he said that when he arrived, she wasn't ready to leave yet, so he took his son to a nearby park, where they played for a while. When they returned to the house, Jerry claimed that Marianne had left a note on the counter stating that the car wouldn't start and she'd popped over to the corner store and would be right back. He claimed he waited for hours, but she never returned. It had been Marianne's mother 2 days later who'd report her missing. Meanwhile, Jerry had moved back into the family home and kicked out the boarder who had been staying there. Marianne's mother never believed Jerry's story. Marianne had been in a car accident a few years before her disappearance, and it had left her with a permanent limp, which she treated with a lift in her shoe, but walking was so uncomfortable for her, and her mother doubts she would ever have popped over anywhere on foot. When detectives first interviewed Jerry at the property, they noted an area of the garage that had freshly dug dirt, with cardboard over top in an attempt to conceal it. When probed, Jerry gave conflicting statements about why he had dug a hole in his garage. The dug area was about 6 feet by 3 feet. Days later, they came back with a search warrant to excavate the hole, but it had again looked different than when the officer had first seen it. They dug 5 feet down, but there was no sign of anything. The search warrant was also exercised within the home, and the note that Jerry had claimed had gotten thrown away was found in the living room. The note, however, didn't say what Jerry had originally stated. The crumpled piece of paper stated, quote, "Had to run a quick errand, be right back." No mention of the car not starting or the corner store. When detectives canvassed the neighborhood, no one could recall seeing Marianne that day. But when detectives tried to confirm Jerry's story, they discovered that he'd called into work that morning, and when he returned the following day, his co-workers noted he had bandages on his arm. Jerry had given conflicting statements about what he'd been doing that day, and no one was able to confirm his whereabouts for the day his wife had gone missing. Jerry never seemed overly concerned about where Marianne had gone. He'd always told people that she had run away to start a new life, and would tell people often that he'd got postcards and calls from her, but Marianne's family have stated that they've never heard or seen Marianne since the day she disappeared, also noting none of her belongings were packed and her bank account was never touched after she disappeared. Plus, the biggest flaw in Jerry's argument was that Marianne loved her son and would never, ever leave him behind. Without ever finding a body, detectives didn't have enough evidence to arrest Jerry Bagginstose, so he was allowed to move on, live his life, get remarried, and concrete over his garage. In 2018, Marianne's cold case would be reopened, with detectives going through all the original evidence in the case. The smoking gun would eventually be the note, according to Jerry, that had been written by Marianne. Another search warrant was issued for Jerry's home on September 2022. He had never moved from the home his first wife had disappeared from. Law enforcement would collect multiple items from the home, and some of those were handwriting samples from Jerry. The samples were examined and ultimately determined to be a match to that note. Jerry had written the note, not Marianne. also searched with the backyard of the home as well as the garage area. Detectives now believe that Jerry Bagginstose murdered his wife and originally hid her body in the garage, but when detectives had poked around and asked about the freshly dug dirt, he had dug her body back up and relocated her to somewhere else. However, detectives weren't able to find her remains on the property. On December 15, 2022, Jerry Bagginstose was arrested. Now 67 years old, he was charged with 1 count of criminal homicide for the murder of Marianne.
The arrest of Jerry Bagginstose reflects decades of hard work and dedication by law enforcement personnel beginning in 1984 with members of the Peckway Township Police Department and continuing with numerous criminal investigators in the Pennsylvania State Police leading up to the present day.
Bagginstose is being held in custody while he awaits trial. He has so far pleaded not guilty. A trial date has not been set yet, but the family of Marianne look forward to seeing Jerry Bagginstose in court and hopefully receiving justice for Marianne, even after 4 decades. Number 2. Rita Curran. It was the summer of 1971 when 24-year-old Rita Curran moved into a shared home in Burlington, Vermont. Rita was a school teacher, but that summer she was going to be working on her graduate degree and working as a housekeeper at a nearby motel. On July 19th, Rita returned home after a rehearsal with her a cappella singing group around 10 p.m. At the time when Rita went to bed, her roommates had all been home, but they had all left together to go get drinks at a nearby bar, leaving Rita alone. Hours later, the roommates returned home and made a horrible discovery. Bloody handprints were seen on the kitchen door, and then they found Rita's body in their room. They checked her body for a pulse, but immediately knew it was too late. She was cold to the touch. Rita had been viciously attacked. She was covered in defensive injuries, indicating that she had fought for her life, but was ultimately overpowered. An autopsy determined she'd been strangled to death. The killer had also sexually assaulted her. The crime scene was bloody and noted as particularly violent. Rita was covered in bruises. Her clothing, a robe, and nightgown had been torn in half. Several key pieces of evidence were found at the scene, which included a cigarette butt, a hair found in Rita's hand, and blood evidence that had likely come from the killer. Initially, detectives presumed it might have been a robbery gone wrong. They hypothesized that someone had been casing the house, saw the 3 roommates leave, and took that opportunity to rob the home, but discovered Rita was still there. But that was quickly ruled out when they discovered Rita's purse still had cash in it, as well as her car keys, and her car were found undisturbed. Next, the detectives went about to establish how the killer had gotten into the apartment. There had been no signs of forced entry or anything to indicate which door the killer had come in. The blood evidence on the back door indicated which door the killer had gone out of. They interviewed the roommates and asked about their door locking habits, and they revealed they only had 1 key that they all shared. When they had left Rita to go to the bar that night, they had left both the front and back door unlocked. The roommates were all cleared as suspects, as well as their boyfriends. Neighbors were also interviewed, which included a newly married couple that rented the apartment 2 floors above the girls. According to them, they didn't hear anything, and they both were each other's alibi, so they were ruled out as well. The investigation had gone on for months, with hundreds of hours dedicated to solving Rita's murder, but ultimately there wasn't enough evidence to get a solid suspect. Unfortunately, during that time, there had been a string of violent attacks on women. None appeared connected to Rita's case. In 1984, following the arrest of well-known serial killer Ted Bundy, Burlington PD established a theory that Rita may have been one of his early victims. They thought there might have been a connection because the motel Rita worked at was close to where Bundy had been born. Bundy was asked several times if he'd killed Rita Curran, and he denied it until his execution in 1989. Later, his DNA was tested against the DNA found at the crime scene, and Bundy was ultimately ruled out as a suspect. Throughout the years, the case was reopened multiple times. Rita's parents passed, never knowing what happened to their daughter, though her siblings would continue to search for justice. In 2014, evidence in the case was retested. They got a solid DNA profile from the cigarette butt found at the crime scene. It was entered into CODIS, but never led to an identification. In 2021, 50 years had passed since Rita's murder. It grew to be the oldest case in Burlington PD history. It was then that the evidence was again re-examined with new forensic techniques, and they got more DNA evidence from the housecoat, nightgown, and linoleum in the bedroom, which ultimately was tied back to the same DNA found on the cigarette. After 5 decades, many of the original suspects were long gone, but detectives reached out to one of the neighbors one more time, the wife of the couple who lived 2 floors above Rita, but this time her story had changed since 1971. When re-interviewed, she said that her husband at the time, William DeRoos, had instructed her to say that he'd been with her all night. She said at the time she hadn't been concerned. Her husband had said his criminal history would make him an automatic suspect, and she felt that that made sense and lied to the police. In actuality, her lie had given her sleepless nights because he hadn't been with her. She revealed that evening they had their first big fight since their marriage, and he had, quote, gone for a walk to let off steam, and come back sometime after midnight, giving her husband about an hour and a half of time completely unaccounted for. She revealed that after Rita's death, her marriage with William had quickly spiraled downwards. They would eventually divorce, and the two parted ways. As far as she knew, it had been William's plan to move to Thailand to become a Buddhist monk. Detectives began to piece together William DeRoos's life after he moved from Vermont. They found that he'd gotten remarried in San Francisco in 1974, and that marriage was also quickly absolved when his second wife learned of his violent tendencies. When asked about her marriage, she told detectives she witnessed him stabbing a friend in the abdomen completely out of the blue, and she had quickly left him when they were having dinner one night and he started to strangle her suddenly without any provocation. It was that incident that made her pack her bags and flee the marriage. William DeRoos died in 1983 of a drug overdose alone in a motel in San Francisco. DNA evidence confirmed that DeRoos had murdered Rita Curran. During a press conference, C.C. Moore, the head geologist at Parabon Nanolabs, said, quote, even though he's dead and there won't be justice, it is really a positive outcome. Rita's siblings are grateful to have answers as to who killed their sister. They thanked Burlington PD for their years of hard work to close the investigation.
Just a few days ago, we filled this room with about 60 detectives, Burlington Police Department staff, and my family. We had a nice lunch and shared stories. We thanked everyone in the Burlington Police Department for all they did to solve my sister's case. I thanked them again this morning. Rita went to Mount St. Mary's Academy in Burlington. She lived at home while attending Trinity College. It was a good home with the 3 of us kids, our parents, and our grandfather. Rita and I lived at home until each of us was 24 years old. The difference was the 2 weeks after Rita moved out, her life was cut short. Amongst all the pictures of Rita on the internet, the 2 most often shown are one taken from her driver's license and one from her yearbook. What's not shown is a little poem by E.B. Browning that she chose to be next to her yearbook picture. Little did she know that that poem would soon appear on her gravestone. Her headstone reads, "Our daughter Rita. I seek no copy now of all life's first half. Leave here the pages with long missing curls and write me new my future's epigraph. New angel mine, unhoped for in the future. Unhoped for in the world, I'm sorry. Life in those days was very different. My parents didn't have social workers and specialized grievance counselors. They had the confessional and the rosary beads. My mother came here from Ireland, and my father from Newfoundland. We were an old-fashioned, strong Catholic family. I don't think so much about the guy who did this as I do about Rita and my parents, what they went through. I pray to my parents, and I pray to Rita. My wife, Nancy, tells me we will get through this. We are Curran strong.
Number 1. Amanda Gonzalez. It had been around Halloween in 2001 when 19-year-old Amanda Gonzalez called her mother, Gloria Bates, while deployed at a military base in Germany. During that call, Amanda revealed that she was 4 months pregnant. It had been a surprise, but welcomed, and Amanda and her mother talked at length. After the call, Gloria booked plane tickets for her daughter to come home for Christmas. Amanda was on her first deployment, and she was enjoying Germany, but her first year in the military was proving a little bit of a challenge. The work itself was fine. She was a private and worked as a cook on the base. Amanda had always wanted to help people. She'd always been a bright student in school and had dreams of becoming a physiotherapist for children, and it had shocked her family when she came home and enlisted in the military. She had planned to serve her time and use her GI Bill to cover her schooling to be a physiotherapist. The military also gave her the opportunity to travel the world, and when the chance came to go to Europe came up, Amanda signed up. She did disclose to her mom that she was experiencing bullying from other military personnel, but she believed it wasn't anything she couldn't handle. Amanda had always been independent and was known to hold her own. In the military, her nickname had been Firecracker. However, Amanda never made it back to Texas for Christmas. On November 5th, Amanda failed to report to work. She was found in the third-floor barracks. Her cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation, and experts determined her time of death was likely 2 days before she'd been found. Now, many details of Amanda's murder investigation are not public, since the investigation was being handled by both the FBI and the military. We don't know what evidence was collected or how many suspects were developed. For the next 2 decades, Gloria Bates advocated for her daughter. She wrote to members of Congress and various TV shows like Dr. Phil and America's Most Wanted, anything to bring media attention, making sure Amanda's murder wasn't swept under the rug. When Vanessa Guilin was murdered in Fort Hood by a fellow soldier, it brought up waves of emotion for Gloria, who couldn't help but notice similarities to Amanda's murder. Then, after 21 years, Gloria received a call from the FBI. They'd made an arrest. Shannon L. Wilkerson, now 42, was arrested in Florida for the murder of Private Amanda Gonzalez. At the time of the murder, Wilkerson was a member of the armed forces, but soon after was discharged from the military. Wilkerson was charged under the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act with 1 count of first-degree murder. He faces a sentence of life in prison and has so far pleaded not guilty. I'm not sure if we'll hear more about this case when it goes to trial, but if you want me to keep an eye on this case, let me know in the comments below. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 3 solved cold cases that were only closed when the suspect came forward with a confession. Let's get into it. Number 1. Theodore John Conrad. 71-year-old Thomas Rendell had lived a very seemingly normal life. He'd been married to his wife for 40 years. They lived in Lynnfield, Massachusetts. He worked at a country club as a golf pro. His daughter was grown and had started a family of her own. But Thomas was hiding a secret, one that he only revealed in his final days. He'd been diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, and before his death on May 18, 2021, he shocked his family with a revelation they never thought possible. His name wasn't Thomas, their last name wasn't Rendell, and he'd been a wanted fugitive on the run from the FBI since 1969. It was on July 14, 1969 in Cleveland, Ohio, when the Society National Bank opened its doors on Monday morning and discovered there was $215,000 missing from their bank vault. An investigation of the stolen funds began and started with the last person who had closed the vault the previous Friday. 20-year-old teller Theodore John Conrad, who also wasn't among the bank employees that arrived early that morning, was the first suspect. The investigation revealed that Theodore had walked out of the bank after closing with a brown paper bag filled with cash and had simply walked away from his life. A warrant for his arrest went out, but with a 2-day head start, it left law enforcement at a disadvantage. Conrad is reported to have never contacted his family in Ohio ever again, leaving behind his parents and 3 siblings, but he wrote letters to a girlfriend, confirming he stayed in the U.S. with letters coming from Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Hawaii. In one of the letters, he revealed he had intentions to return home in 7 years, once the statute of limitations ran out on the theft. But he then discovered that wasn't going to happen on the federal charges of embezzlement. Conrad's crime didn't make much of a splash in the news. A week after the theft was Apollo 11's historic flight to the moon, which dominated the attention of all of the news outlets, giving Conrad even more time to escape and settle in somewhere with next to no one watching him. However, one U.S. Marshal made it his mission to find Conrad. John Elliott devoted his entire career to searching, eventually retiring in 1990. He passed on the investigation to his son, Peter Elliott, who was also a U.S. Marshal. Through the investigation and interviewing those who'd been close to Conrad, no one really believed he'd stolen the money in some sort of grand heist. He just wanted to do it to see if he could get away with it. The early belief that he could just return home after 7 years had been an indication that he hadn't really thought through his punishment for the crimes, and he hadn't really put much thought into leaving his whole life forever. Conrad was reported to have been obsessed with the movie The Thomas Crown Affair. That had come out in 1968 and had been filmed in Boston. It followed a bank robber played by Steve McQueen, who was a bank executive who walked out of a bank with $2.6 million. The film featured a character with expensive taste in luxury cars and high-end liquor, and Conrad wanted to emulate the character Thomas.
Conversations with several of his friends discussing the hypothetical prospect of being able to pull something like this off. He examined what type of security existed there, and this was just a challenge for him, as it were, to override this.
Teddy Conrad's plan was very simple. At lunch hour that day, he would leave and walk 1 block south to this spot here on St. Clair in Cleveland. And he would go to a liquor store, which was here 17 years ago. And he bought himself a bottle of Canadian Club, which of course was wrapped in a brown paper bag. At quitting time that day, he told his partner inside the vault that it was okay to go ahead and leave, that he would be along in a couple of minutes. Alone, Teddy allegedly put $215,000 in the bottom of the bag, put the liquor bottle on top, left the vault, shouted to the guard, and walked out.
$215,000, while at the time was a lot of money. It was equivalent to about $1.5 million in today's dollars. It wasn't enough to live off for the rest of his life, and at only 20, it certainly wasn't enough to retire off of. But after 5 decades, it was starting to look like a case that was never going to be solved until Peter Elliott saw an obituary that caught his attention. Thomas Rendell's obituary revealed details that closely matched Conrad's, and it made Elliott take a closer look into who this Rendell person was. Rendell started appearing in Massachusetts in 1970. There had been no record of him before that. From records, it appeared that Conrad walked into a Boston Social Security office with a new identity and got a Social Security card with a new forged identity. From there, he was able to live his life very normally, opening a bank account, working, paying taxes. No concern had ever been raised about Thomas Rendell. Rendell certainly hadn't lived an extravagant life. He spent several decades working as a car salesman. He and his wife had declared bankruptcy in 2014, and when he died, he didn't leave a substantial sum of money for his children to inherit. Once Elliott had enough evidence to connect Rendell to Conrad, he interviewed his family, who admitted that on his deathbed, Rendell revealed that he was Theodore Conrad, a wanted fugitive for a bank robbery. His wife Kathy made the decision not to go to law enforcement with the deathbed confession. She stated that she was still grieving the loss of her husband, and she said he was a great man. Many of his friends had similar sentiments. He was known as a nice, caring man who loved golf and cars. He was never known to badmouth anyone, raise his temper or voice, wasn't a drinker, and didn't gamble. But after it was revealed, little things started to make sense. Rendell always wore a beard. It was a running joke that in group photos, he would always put on sunglasses. He never talked about his family or where he grew up, but people just chalked it up to a bad childhood. A close family friend told the media, quote, "The man I knew didn't change all of a sudden because of something he did a lifetime ago. He was a good man, he was a good friend, and I think no less of him today than I did when all this came out, and I'd love to go play another round of golf with him." Conrad has surviving siblings who are relieved to know he lived a happy life. Theodore's parents had passed, never knowing what happened to their son, and much of their family had believed he had died after he disappeared for decades. After 52 years, the mystery of what happened to Theodore Conrad and the bank heist he committed has been closed. His family is not being looked at further, the money is believed to have been spent on bad investments before Conrad was married, and there won't be any criminal charges made for his family for not immediately going to law enforcement with the deathbed confession. Number 2. James Eric Crisp. It was on March 10, 2019 when Roger Lloyd Taylor vanished. Following an argument with his wife, the 48-year-old had got into his car to go pick her up from his daughter's house in Monroe County, Alabama. On the way, he texted his daughter that he was lost, and that was the last anyone heard from him. Days later, his car was recovered abandoned on the side of the road. For weeks, law enforcement and local search parties searched the area where his vehicle was found, but there was no sign of Roger.
It was heartbreaking. It's to the point now where he's been gone so long. If he was found alive, it'd be a miracle. But the probability of it is really, really low.
261 days. That's how long Alyssa Taylor's father has been missing.
There's no closure. I don't think that you could ever get closure not knowing what happened to your child, your brother, your uncle, your dad.
Taylor says the last couple of months have been filled with sorrow and anger. And with the holiday season rolling around, her family is leaning on each other.
We talk a lot more than we used to. I mean, it's sad that tragic events bring families together, but they really do. We all talk a lot more than we used to and talk about him and what he was like and what he used to do, and it always leads back to where he could be. And we want to give him what he deserves. What every family wants is, nobody wants nobody to die, but you want to be able to visit them and honor that person, and our family doesn't have that.
Oftentimes, the pain is too hard to bear.
I try not to think about it. You have time to grieve and cope with it a little bit, but then again, you don't. So some days you wake up and it's just like it just happened again.
His family revealed that they feared he'd had a medical emergency, as he'd only recently recovered from a heart attack and a stroke. which had left him with permanent physical mobility issues and memory lapses. His vehicle didn't show any signs of mechanical issues, and it's unclear what had happened to him. Weeks turned into months and then years. Without any new evidence, Roger's disappearance turned into a cold case, leaving his family with so many questions. A cold case that may have never been solved. However, in September 2022, a shocking revelation in the case came from a pastor who walked into the Monroe County Sheriff's Office and confessed to killing Roger Taylor. 37-year-old James Eric Crisp claimed that since the murder, he'd gone on to become a pastor and found God and needed to confess in order to go forward with his life. Crisp stated that in 2019, he'd gotten into a physical altercation with Roger and had killed him, then disposed of his body 10 miles from where his vehicle had been left.
James Eric Crisp walked into my office of his own free will and confessed to have killing Mr. Taylor.
48 hours later, 37-year-old James Eric Crisp was being led into Monroe County Justice Court for a bond hearing on one count of manslaughter for the death of 48-year-old Roger Lloyd Taylor of Sulligent, Alabama. According to the sheriff, Crisp said he killed Taylor on March 10, 2019, and disposed of the victim's body. Taylor's truck was discovered on Blair Cemetery Road in Monroe County a couple of days after he was reported missing. Searches since then have turned up no evidence, and the case went cold until this week.
He didn't reveal why or how he'd gotten into an altercation with Rogers, but Rogers' daughter doesn't believe that the two knew each other. She did reveal that she knew Crisp, and went on to say that Crisp had been involved in multiple search parties that had gone out to look for Roger in 2019. Crisp had a lengthy criminal history, and in 2019 he faced a 30-year prison sentence for various drug crimes, but entered God's House of Hope, a Christian rehab center, as part of his bail condition, got sober, and went on to become a pastor and counselor. After Crisp's confession, he was charged with manslaughter. Roger's children attended the bond hearing. Roger's daughter said that in a statement to the media, quote, "He looked me in the eye and told me he killed my dad. He didn't say he was sorry. He just said that he hoped one day I could find it in his heart to forgive him, but never even said he was sorry. He didn't have any emotions. When he was outside of the room, he was laughing with the jailer and walked in and acted all stone cold with me." She doesn't believe Crisp's confession is motivated by his newfound faith, but rather she believes that someone close to Crisp knew about the murder and was going to come forward to law enforcement. Crisp is said to be helping to locate Roger's body. However, the area in question had recently been subject to flooding and is said to have shifted the landscape and has made finding his body more difficult. At this time, Roger Taylor's body has yet to be found. Crisp has asked for the Taylor family's forgiveness. However, they said in a response, "If we can't have his body back, we won't have closure." Number 3, Michael Townsend. It was October 12, 1991, when 43-year-old Linda Lois Little missed her shift at the Chart House restaurant in Daytona Beach, Florida. It was very unusual for Linda to miss work, and it was her co-worker and friend who reported her missing. She was last seen at Matey's Brig with a group of friends. At the bar, she told her friends that her boyfriend was coming to see her on the weekend, and they went through all the must-see spots in Daytona she had to take him to. That was also why it was so strange that Linda had disappeared, as it was clear to her friends that she had no plans to leave the area. Law enforcement canvassed the area and found a last sighting of the missing woman. Around 2 a.m., she was spotted riding her bike home and stopping at 7-Eleven. There she purchased a donut and a chocolate milk before heading in the direction of her apartment. Her apartment was found undisturbed, which led investigators to believe she'd been abducted shortly after leaving the 7-Eleven. Her body nor her bike were ever found. Her missing persons case eventually went cold once all leads were exhausted, and her family had always prayed for answers, but without a body, there was little hope of ever knowing what happened to Linda Little. For 3 decades, the case remained cold until Daytona Beach Police Department received a call from an incarcerated inmate recently transferred to the Tomoka Correctional Facility in Volusia County. 53-year-old Michael Townsend was serving a life sentence for the brutal 2007 murder of Sherry Carmanto, and while serving his sentence, he, quote, found God and the Lord placed it in his heart to confess, and also revealed being close to the area he had committed another crime had weighed heavy on his heart, and he wanted to confess to a crime he committed in 1991. He alleged that he'd gone to Daytona Beach for his birthday and met a woman at a bar. He said that the two had a couple of drinks, but she had said something that made him snap, and he confessed to abducting, strangling, and burying the body of Linda Little. In addition to confessing to Linda's murder, he confessed to murdering 2 other women in Florida. At this time, investigations are still ongoing to corroborate these confessions. However, Daytona Beach had enough information to determine whether this confession was credible for Linda Little's murder. When asked why he killed the 4 women he confessed to murdering, he stated that he'd been abused by his father and grandfather as a child and blamed his mother and the other women in his life growing up for not protecting him, and grew to have a hatred towards women. 31 years after Linda's disappearance, her murderer was finally charged. Townsend was indicted by a grand jury on October 24, 2022, on the charge of first-degree murder. An ongoing investigation is still going to recover Linda's body in the area where Townsend admitted to burying her, as well as the other murders of the other women. If determined that all the killings he confessed to are credible, Townsend will be classified as a serial killer. Already serving a life sentence, he will remain in prison for the rest of his life, or may face the death penalty if convicted. Linda's sister, Wanda Henson, thanked Townsend for coming forward and confessing. She said at the press conference announcing his arrest that she was grateful to have answers about her sister, and went on to say that she forgives him.
Allow Linda's sister, Wanda, to say a few words if she would like.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the media being here to let our police department get the recognition that they deserve, in our state attorney's office and our sheriff's department through the years, staying on this case and never, ever, ever giving up. And I really appreciate y'all. Words can't express it. Claire's been right there from the very beginning, and appreciate that. And we were just talking about the actions of one person. We need to stop the cycle. We need to put out more love and stop the cycle of, because just one man's actions has affected generations now. Linda's granddaughter now has 4 little kids of her own that never saw her grandmother, never see her great-grandmother. We just need to stop the cycle. But I really appreciate David Donardi here staying on this case all these years, and that's I give you love.
Bye for now.
Cold case cracked. 42 years after a Great Bend woman was found shot to death, her suspected killer is behind bars.
KSN's Alexis Padilla spoke with the victim's daughter today. She has her reaction. It's our top story tonight. Alexis.
Emily, Jeff, Mary Robin Walters' daughter Pamela says although there was finally an arrest, she says she doesn't feel any different today. She already forgave the suspect, Stephen Hanks, years ago.
I already knew who did it. I knew that he wasn't convicted of it, but we knew who did it. We knew it was Stephen Hanks, the neighbor.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 4 more recently solved cold cases thanks to new DNA evidence. Let's get into it. Number 1. Susan Tice and Erin Gilmore. Susan Tice had just moved to downtown Toronto, Canada. The 45-year-old recently divorced social worker had been alone in the morning of August 17, 1983. Her 4 children were at a family gathering, one that Susan intended to go to as well, but when she didn't show up, her family grew concerned. Her brother-in-law was the one to drive down and check up on Susan. He first knocked on the front door, but no one answered. He went around to the back of the home, and his concern grew immediately when he discovered the back door had been left ajar. The home had been ransacked. He discovered Susan's lifeless body in her bedroom. She'd been stabbed multiple times and sexually assaulted. The Toronto Police Department investigated the murder, however there was little evidence to go on. A neighbor claimed to have heard screaming around 1:30 a.m. the previous night but didn't investigate. The same neighbor also claimed to have heard someone walking around in the alleyway behind their stretch of houses, indicating there may have been a prowler looking for unlocked homes to break into. When asked for an update on the investigation, Toronto PD was quoted as saying, "We have no suspect at all," a crushing blow in a violent murder. 4 months later, on December 20th, 1983, 22-year-old Erin Gilmore was discovered by her boyfriend in her apartment and stabbed to death. Erin lived in an upstairs apartment above her job working for a clothing store. She locked the door to the store at 9 p.m. and was supposed to quickly change and head out for a holiday party. When her boyfriend showed up, he noticed her apartment door was ajar, which initially he thought Erin was going to pop out at any moment. He waited for a second, but she never came to the door, so he decided to go up. The apartment was dark. He called out to her, but she didn't answer. In her bedroom, he noticed something under the duvet in her bed. He pulled it back and found Erin's body, a horrific discovery that he would never forget. Erin was also assaulted, and the window of the crime had been narrow. Erin had closed the store, gone up to her apartment, and her boyfriend came over 20 minutes after the store closed. Investigators hypothesized that Erin might have been stalked, and the killer may have already been in her apartment when she finished her shift. Erin's father was a prominent businessman in the Toronto area, and the investigation was put under considerable scrutiny for an arrest, but despite an exhaustive search, no suspect was found. Eventually both cases would go cold, but law enforcement had one thing: DNA evidence left behind by the killer. The cases were linked in 2000, when cold case detectives were cataloging old crimes and uploading DNA samples to a provincial database. Despite the crimes being in relatively close proximity, both in location and time, and similar circumstances, the cases had never been connected. While this brought renewed hopes of solving the case, the new DNA lead didn't lead to any arrest for another 15 years. When the Golden State Killer was arrested in 2018, thanks to genetic genealogy, Erin's younger brother Sean reached out to the Toronto Cold Case Unit to ask if the same technology could be used to find Erin's killer. They reached out to Othram Labs in Texas, and they started working on the DNA profile left at Susan and Erin's crime scenes. Initially, there wasn't a lot of hope. They were using GEDmatch, which relies on people volunteering their DNA from services like Ancestry.com and 23andMe to build family trees, and the pool the suspect's DNA was from was incredibly vast, indicating that not a lot of people from his family had done any genetic testing. They had more than 3,000 names to go through. As they got closer to narrowing down the pool, they would eventually serve 61-year-old Joseph George Sutherland with a warrant requesting his DNA. His DNA was a match. After 39 years, Toronto police were able to make an official arrest in the cold case murders of both Susan Tice and Erin Gilmore. In 1983, Sutherland was 22 years old and had moved to Toronto from Moosonee, Ontario. He lived there for only a few months before the first murder. He moved back to Moosonee in the early 2000s, where he lived since. He had married, divorced, and had children. For the last decade, he worked for child welfare services in the area. He had no criminal history at the time of his arrest. He has been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was arrested without incident. The arresting detective claimed that Sutherland knew the arrest was coming and had seemed to expect their arrival. That same detective also stated that they would be going through old cold cases to see if there were more victims connected to Sutherland. He's being held in custody while he awaits further court proceedings.
I'm Sean McCowan, and I'm here with my brother Kaylin, and Erin was our sister. On behalf of Erin's family and many, many friends, we're all very, very happy that an arrest has obviously been made in the vicious murders of Erin and Susan Tice. The last few days have brought around a full spectrum of emotions, as you can imagine, and this is a day that I and we have been waiting almost an entire lifetime for. In a sense, there's a real relief that someone's been arrested, yet it also brings back so many memories of Erin and her brutal, senseless murder. Erin was our sister, she was a daughter, and she was an amazing friend to everyone around her. She had a magnetic personality, was a natural beauty, and was always full of life and looking for her next adventure and bringing people together. At the age of 22, she had her whole life ahead of her before she was killed 5 days before Christmas. She'd never had a chance to be an aunt to her 4 nieces and 3 nephews. She never had a chance to live her life, never get married, never be a mother, and never had a chance to see what could have been. It was an incredible life to be lived that was taken away from her and the rest of us. We will always wonder what could have been and miss her presence and miss growing old with her. This arrest finally brings an answer for all of us to almost 39 years of asking who. Our mom, Anna, passed away 2 years ago, and she would have been so relieved that there had been an arrest, and so happy that someone will finally face justice after being anonymous for 39 years. Erin's murder stayed with her, and it was very, very difficult for her to talk about it. She lost her only daughter, and she missed Erin every day. It finally puts a name and a face to someone who, for all of us, has been a ghost. It's truly incredible we are here today. I don't want to say that any of us ever gave up hope, but almost over 4 decades, we began to wonder if we would ever get to this resolution. We're so thankful that technology finally caught up and provided the incredible detectives at TPS a new set of clues and ultimately an answer. We cannot thank the detectives at Cold Case enough. We owe many thanks to so many over the years, and I'm sure I'm missing some, but Rocky Cleveland, Vaughn O'Toole, Ray Zarb, Greg Groves, Reg Pitts, David Gracie, Bob Wilkinson, Steve Ryan, and of course, Stacy Gallant, Andrew Groves, Steve Smith, who I owe special thanks to for taking my calls and answering my questions, and every time saying, we just need more time. Until just a few days ago when I received the best call I've ever received. You all never gave up on trying to solve this case, and we are grateful beyond anything we can ever express. I'd also like to thank all the people and techs at Parabon Labs and Othram for their dedication in allowing the science to help resolve these painful chapters in our lives. As well, many thanks to all the journalists we've spoken to over the years who helped keep Erin's case present and relevant. Erin and Susan are finally getting their day.
Number 2, Mary Robin Walter. It was on January 24, 1980, when 23-year-old Mary, who went by her middle name Robin, Walter, was found fatally shot in her home. Robin was married, a new mother, as well as a nursing student in Barton County, Kansas. Law enforcement went to the home when neighbors reported hearing several gunshots nearby, and it was then discovered that Robin's body was inside. Detectives canvassed the area and quickly learned of a neighbor, Stephen Hanks, who soon became a lead suspect in the murder case. However, there hadn't been enough evidence to arrest him, and he was eventually released. Hanks was arrested and charged with another crime in 1981 when he broke into a co-worker's home. He was charged with sexual assault, battery, robbery, and burglary. He had stalked this victim for months and attacked her in her home on 2 separate occasions. He served a decade behind bars for this and was released in 1993. Robin's case eventually went cold and became Kansas's oldest cold case murder. It had been reopened and reinvestigated over the decades, but nothing notable came up. In April 2022, the case was reassigned to Detective Sergeant Adam Hales, who had restarted the investigation from the very beginning. Around the same time he was assigned the case, he also contracted COVID-19 and was isolated at home with the case, giving him ample time to go over everything with a fine-tooth comb. In the case files, he noticed there were some irregularities with some of the witness statements, and he hasn't revealed exactly what he found in the evidence box, but he found something that led him to believe that there was more evidence connecting Hanks to the murder than was originally thought. The new evidence was enough to request a DNA sample, and from there they were able to positively connect Stephen Hanks to the 1980 murder of Robin Walter.
After reviewing the case with Sergeant Hales, I directed that 2 other detectives, Detective Alex Lomas, Detective Brian Vocal, as well as Patrol Sergeant Travis Doze, be assigned to the case as time allowed. Lieutenant David Payton supervised the operation. The sheriff's office tracked down numerous individuals that had been involved in the case in the 1980s, and many interviews were conducted as far away as the Pacific Northwest. Several meetings were held with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, who assisted us with this investigation. In October of this year, new evidence was obtained that allowed the sheriff's office to submit the case to the Barton County attorney, Mr. Levi Morris, for review. After approximately 4 weeks of review, Mr. Morris obtained an arrest warrant for murder in the second degree and the arrest of Stephen L. Hanks, age 68, of Burden, Kansas.
Stephen Hanks was arrested in early December 2022 and was charged with second-degree murder. Hanks is now 68 years old. Robin Walters' parents, husband and sister, weren't able to see the arrest as they are now deceased. Robin's daughter has said that she forgave her mother's killer years ago.
I was about 18. I had a rough time at that time at 18. And I got to a point where I had to let go of a lot of stuff. And so when I let go of that, I gave it to God, and I felt peace.
Peace that led her to forgiving her mother's killer.
I wish I could talk to him and tell him I forgave him.
Number 3, Michael Sharp. In the summer of 1984, 4 women lived their worst nightmare. Starting June 3, 1984, a 25-year-old woman identified as Jane Doe No. 1 in Bloomsfield, Connecticut, woke up to a man standing over her bed. He had entered through a screen door to her apartment. He put a gun to her head and told her he would shoot her and her roommate, who was sleeping in the other room. It was dark and he blindfolded her. Then he sexually assaulted her before looking for valuables and getting a beer from the fridge. She reported this to the authorities, and a sexual assault kit and other evidence were collected. Jane Doe No. 2, a 30-year-old woman living in Middletown, Connecticut, was attacked on June 26, 1984. The man came in through a sliding door into her apartment, held a gun to the woman's head, blindfolded her, sexually assaulted her. He then robbed her and spent a while in the home before leaving. She also reported this to the police, getting evidence collected and a sexual assault kit taken. On July 24, 1984, in Windsor, Connecticut, a 26-year-old woman woke up to a man in her apartment, and again he did the exact same thing he did to the other 2 victims. This was again reported, and all the evidence was collected. On July 24, 1984, a 24-year-old mother was asleep in her bed with her 2-year-old daughter when she woke up to a man holding a gun to her head. He began to touch her. She then asked if she could put her daughter in another room. He blindfolded her and guided the mother, holding her child, to another room. She put her daughter to bed. He then took her back to her bedroom and sexually assaulted her. He stayed around the home to look for valuables and something to eat before leaving. The daughter was never harmed. All of these women have had their names kept secret. They all have similar stories, and they didn't see much. It was dark, and they were blindfolded very quickly. Authorities in these 4 places were able to notice a pattern in all these women's stories, and in 1990 they would connect all 4 cases to a single DNA source. The same man had attacked these women. Unfortunately, there was no match in federal or state databases, and through the years they were never able to find a match. The Connecticut Cold Case Unit used genetic genealogy to try and find a match for these women's attacker. Using publicly available genealogy information that had been uploaded to public databases, investigators were able to narrow down a suspect. The suspect's name was Michael Sharp, and he was a former CEO of a charter school organization. On November 9, 2020, investigators were able to obtain a DNA sample from garbage that had been left on the curb of Sharp's home. The DNA matched the 4 sexual assault kits from 1984. They were able to get a search warrant and obtain a DNA sample directly from Sharp, which also was an exact match. On November 17, 2020, Sharp was arrested for kidnapping in the first degree with a firearm. He was arrested for kidnapping because in 1984, the statute of limitations for sexual assault was only 5 years, but that was not the case for kidnapping charges. The Connecticut Cold Case Unit got a call from all 4 of these women to tell them that they had not been forgotten and their attacker had been arrested. Sharp was finally charged with 8 counts of first-degree kidnapping with a firearm, 2 counts for each woman. In 2021, he pleaded not guilty and he turned down a plea bargain for 25 years in jail, going forward to trial. On November 2, 2022, a jury returned with a guilty verdict on all counts after less than an hour of deliberations. Michael Sharp now faces 25 to 100 years in prison when he's sentenced in January 2023.
I don't know, but I'm so sorry. So sorry.
The 4 women, after the conviction, revealed their names to the public. No more Jane Doe. Linda, Shelley, Kathy, and Roseanne finally had justice for the horrific attacks they survived in 1984. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing the Torso Killer, a prolific serial killer who was recently confessed to several additional murders, closing a slew of cold cases from the New Jersey area in the 1960s to 1980s. Let's get into it. On May 22, 1980, police were called to the Quality Inn Motel in Hasbrook Heights after a housekeeper reported hearing screams coming from room 117. When police arrived, they apprehended and arrested a man fleeing the motel. He was carrying a fake gun, a switchblade in his pocket, and a bag that had several pairs of handcuffs, prescription pills, a ball gag, and other bondage items. When they got to the room, they found a young woman handcuffed around the ankles, bitten, bruised, and bleeding. The man was Richard Cottingham, 33 years old at the time of his arrest. He was charged with kidnapping, attempted murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, aggravated sexual assault while armed, possession of a weapon, and possession of controlled substances. He had a $350,000 bail set, and he never made bail. The young woman was revealed to be Leslie Ann O'Dell. She was an 18-year-old runaway who had been working as a sex worker in Manhattan a few days before Cottingham had picked her up and taken her to New Jersey. She was tortured and sexually assaulted, and she started screaming when she thought her life was about to end. She would later testify that he, quote, said, "You have to take it. The other girls did. You have to too. You're a whore and you have to be punished." After his arrest, police went to the home he rented in Lodi, New Jersey, which he shared with his wife and 3 children. There they found a room he locked from his family. In this room was jewelry and clothing from several women. Other items were also found in his car. Authorities started to take a look at Cottingham for other crimes. Richard Cottingham was born November 25, 1946 in the Bronx, New York. His family later moved to New Jersey. He graduated high school from Pascagoula Valley High School in Hillsdale, New Jersey. After graduation, he worked at Metropolitan Life. He started in the mailroom, but after taking some computer courses, he became a computer operator. In 1966, he left that job to become a computer operator for Blue Cross Blue Shield Association. He was still working there when he was arrested in 1980. He lived with his parents until they moved away and he got married. He was known to be seen helping his mother around the house. On May 3, 1970, he married his wife Janet and they had 3 children together. In 1978, his wife filed for divorce. In the divorce records, his wife alleged that he had started leaving the family without the necessary funds for essentials, that he would come home in the early hours of the morning. He was known to frequent a swingers club in New York called Pluto's Retreat. She removed the petition for divorce when he was arrested in 1980, but they did get divorced after his 1981 conviction. During the investigation, they were able to tie Cottingham to a murder that had occurred in the same motel on May 5, 1980, 17 days before he was arrested. The victim, Valere Street, was a 19-year-old sex worker who was found under the bed by housekeeping in one of the motel rooms. She'd been naked, handcuffed behind her back. Valere had been strangled to death. They found a fingerprint on the handcuff that was matched to Cottingham. This would start authorities down the path of discovering a serial killer. In the next few months, other authorities, as well as New Jersey police, would tie Cottingham to some horrific crimes. In the months following his arrest, he would be tied to another murder that occurred at the Quality Inn Motel in Hasbrook Heights. On December 15, 1977, 26-year-old Marianne Carr, an X-ray technician who had just celebrated her first wedding anniversary a few months earlier, was found by a fence in the parking lot outside the motel. She was found with a ligature still around her neck, with evidence she had been restrained with what might have been handcuffs and had tape residue over her mouth. She had small cuts and bite marks all over her body. She had last been seen at her apartment in Little Ferry, New Jersey, an apartment complex that Cottingham had lived in a few years earlier with his wife. Her apartment key was found in the lockbox of trophies found in Cottingham's home. In New York, he would be charged with the murders of 3 sex workers at 2 different crime scenes. On December 2, 1979, firefighters were called to a Travel Inn hotel near Times Square, with reports of a room being on fire. When they arrived, they discovered 2 bodies in the rubble. When the blaze had been extinguished, they discovered 2 bodies that had been set on fire. Their hands and heads had been removed and were never recovered. After the fire had been put out, authorities found some of the women's clothes folded neatly in the bathtub. They had used these clothes and put them on mannequins from a nearby department store, so they could hopefully use them to identify the women from the fire. They would eventually identify one of the victims as 22-year-old Didi Godazzi. The other victim, believed to be around the age of 16, has never been identified. This killer was given the moniker the Torso Killer. On May 15, 1980, the body of 25-year-old Jean Rayner was found in New York's Seville Hotel. Her breasts were removed and put on the headboard, and the mattress was set on fire. Jean was working as a sex worker at the time to pay for a lengthy child custody battle with her ex-husband. For a time before DNA evidence, Cottingham seemed to be very thorough in cleaning crime scenes, leaving little to no evidence of himself. On June 12, 1981, Cottingham was convicted in New Jersey for the murder of Valere Street. In that same court case, he was charged with the kidnapping and sexual assault of 4 other women. All had survived various attacks. They even testified at the trial. This included the attack on Leslie Ann Odell. He'd been convicted of 3 and acquitted of 1. On October 12, 1982, he was convicted in the murder of Marianne Carr. In 1984, New York authorities extradited him for a trial where he was convicted on July 9, 1984, for the murders of Didi Godazzi and the unknown victim and Jean Rayner. He would serve his nearly 200-year sentence in New Jersey State Prison. Over the next 3 decades, detectives would visit Cottingham often, asking him about unsolved cold cases and always leaving out critical details of the crimes from Cottingham. In 2010, their persistence would finally pay off. One of the detectives was Detective Robert Ancelotti, who interviewed Cottingham over and over for 15 years. He would eventually get confessions that would lead to the closing of several cases. Cottingham never seemed to know the names of his victims, but remembered details of the crimes. In August 2010, Cottingham confessed and was convicted of the murder of Nancy Vogel. In his confession, he gave details only the murderer would know. Nancy Vogel was 29 years old and was killed on October 28, 1967. She was found in her car, naked with her hands tied in front of her, with her clothes neatly folded underneath her. She'd been beaten, strangled, and sexually assaulted. Her husband had reported her missing after she did not come home. She had told her husband that she was going to go play bingo at the church in Little Ferry, New Jersey. Nancy is Cottingham's first known victim. He would have only been 20 when she was killed, and he was still living with his parents at the time. In 2014, Cottingham confessed to Ancelotti 2 more murders he committed, again giving details only the killer would know. First was 18-year-old Irene Blaze, who was found strangled in April 1969 in the Saddle River in Hackensack, New Jersey. She had vanished from her home. The second was 15-year-old Denise Velasca, who was abducted while walking to a friend's house in Emerson, New Jersey. She was found strangled on the side of the road near a cemetery in Saddlebrook, New Jersey. In 2017, he confessed to killing 13-year-old Jacqueline Harp in July 1968 while she was walking home at night after a band practice in Midland Park, New Jersey. She had been strangled with her bag. Though these were official confessions, they were never taken to trial, and Cottingham was not convicted of these murders. The families had agreed that he was already living his life in prison, and it was unnecessary now that they had answers. The facts of this, however, did not come to light until 2020, and the cases were officially closed. In 2017, Cottingham would get another visitor, Jennifer Weiss, the daughter of Dee Dee Gordazzi, who had been given up for adoption and had gone looking for her mother, only to find out in 2002 that her mother had been killed in such a horrific way. She had started writing to Cottingham, and she had decided she would try to be his friend and wanted information about her mother and where he had put her head. She figured the best way to earn his trust was to become his friend, and in 2017, she met him face to face after writing to him. Weiss said that she asked how he knew her mother in that first meeting. Jennifer has continued to visit him, and they have become friends. Weiss has talked at length about how Cottingham should confess before it's too late. On March 2021, Detective Ancelotti informed Cottingham that he was retiring and wanted him to give information on one last case before he did. It went back and forth, but on April 14, 2021, in a recorded interview, Cottingham went into detail about the murders of 2 young women. He even remembered their names. When asked why he remembered their names, he said, "Because I was with them for a couple of days." According to the transcript, he also said, he got to know them. Lorraine Kelly was 16 and Marianne Pryor was 17. Cottingham had abducted them in Montville while they were on their way to the mall. He drove them to a motel and held them for 2 days, sexually assaulting them before he drowned them in a bathtub. He gave detailed accounts of what he did to the girls and the exact location where their bodies would be left in the woods. On October 27, 2021, he confessed to a judge and was convicted for the murders. In August of 2022, New York officials accepted and corroborated a confession that he had beaten and killed 26-year-old Lorraine McGraw on March 1, 1970. In June 2022, DNA evidence entered by the Nassau County Police on a 54-year-old cold case got a hit for Cottingham. His DNA had been entered into federal databases during his 2010 conviction. The cold case was that of Diane Cusack, a 23-year-old who was killed on February 15, 1968. She was a dance teacher who had just finished class and was going to Long Island Mall to buy new dance shoes. She was found in her car strangled. This is the only case so far that has been tied to Cottingham through DNA. After the Nassau County Police interviewed Cottingham about other cold cases in the area, after a thorough comparison of facts and evidence to his confessions, they were able to connect him to 4 other cold cases. Mary Beth Hines, 21, was found in a creek in Long Island on May 20th, 1972. She'd been strangled. Laverne Moy, 23, was a mother of 2. She was found in the same creek strangled on July 20th, 1972. Sheila Hyman, 33, a mother of 3, was found by her husband in their Long Island home on July 20th, 1973. Her cause of death was blunt force trauma. Her children were at summer camp at the time. For years, her husband had been the prime suspect. Lastly was 18-year-old Maria Neves. She was killed on December 27, 1973. She was found with her hands tied behind her back and wrapped in plastic. On December 5, 2022, from his prison hospital bed, Richard Cottingham was convicted of the murder of Diane Cusack, and he had made a non-prosecution agreement for the other 4 murders. He was sentenced to 25 years running concurrently with the 179 years he is currently serving for his past crimes. Richard Cottingham, now 76 years old, had been known as the Torso Killer, and has been behind bars since his 1980 arrest. He's been convicted or officially confessed to 17 murders of women, and he might still have more victims. He has, in past interviews, stated that he's killed between 85 to 100 women. He will die in prison for his horrific crimes that spanned 13 years. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing what has been described as Canada's oldest and most high-profile murder investigation that has now recently been solved thanks to genetic genealogy. Let's get into it. It was on March 29, 1975 when 16-year-old Sharon Pryor left her home in the Pointe St. Charles neighborhood in Montreal, Quebec. She left around 7:30 p.m., leaving her purse at home. Sharon was meeting a group of her friends as well as her boyfriend at a pizzeria only blocks away, but never arrived. Sharon was a sweet and bright teen. She had a caring and nurturing nature and had a particular affinity towards animals. She had dreams of becoming a veterinarian. She was known to be kind and warm and was a remarkable student with a bright future ahead. The oldest of 4 siblings, she was an excellent big sister and always set a good example for them. No one alerted Sharon's parents when she didn't show up at the pizzeria, as her friends had assumed she'd just stayed home that night. It wasn't until hours later, when she missed her curfew, that Sharon's parents figured out her disappearance and called law enforcement. Initially, detectives weren't concerned and felt that Sharon had probably just gone off with her friends, but her parents weren't convinced. Sharon always called home if there was a change in plans and was always home on time. She didn't have a history of running away, and in her bedroom was all her money and bus pass. As precious time passed, detectives eventually concluded that Sharon had been abducted, likely in the alleyway behind their home and on the way to the restaurant. No one saw or heard the abduction. Sharon's mother, Yvonne, remembered something. She said that Sharon had mentioned a strange man had been following her when she'd been walking home a few evenings before. Sharon had started getting male friends to walk with her home after dark. Detectives also believed another attack about an hour before Sharon's disappearance may have been connected. Blocks away from the alleyway Sharon may have been abducted from, 23-year-old Cheryl Roy was attacked a bit before 7 p.m. She was walking alone on her way to the pharmacy to grab diapers for her daughter when she saw a man walking in towards her on the other side of the alleyway. She said that he had his hands in his pockets and looked like he lived in the area. She didn't notice anything visually concerning about the man. She said he seemed very normal and thought he would just continue walking past her and she would go on her way. She continued, then suddenly heard footsteps running towards her. And when she turned around, she was shocked when the man that had walked past her was barreling towards her. The man grabbed her and pushed her against a building. She fought off her attacker, screaming and yelling. He had a knife which he pressed against her throat, telling her to shut up. She cut herself on the blade, pushing the knife away. She begged the man to take her purse, and he said, quote, "I don't want your purse. I want you. I love you." She said he grabbed her hair and was trying to drag her to an empty lot. He was saying, quote, "You're dead. You're not getting away from me. When I get through with you, I'll cut you to pieces." She screamed and struggled for about 6 minutes. Then a group of young boys started to run towards them. They had been investigating the screams. Cheryl knew one of the boys and called out to him. This forced her attacker to back away and run off. After the man ran away, she was helped into a nearby home and called the police. She described the man as about 6 feet tall, 200 pounds, Caucasian, with a mustache. She said he only spoke English and didn't have a French accent. He spoke in a calm, low voice during the entire attack. She also noted he didn't smell like alcohol, and she never got a good look at his face. Cheryl lost her voice for 2 days from the screaming. The man had tried to rip and cut her pants from her body. She thanked the kids for coming to her aid. After the attack, she felt that if she had passed out or hadn't made so much noise to attract others to help, she would be dead. Though, unlike in Sharon's case, she didn't feel that she'd been stalked by her attacker. She didn't feel like she'd seen him before. The attack had felt completely random and unprovoked. It had been early in the evening, in a well-populated area, a bold attack. Detectives felt that 2 attacks in the same evening in the same area were not a coincidence. Cheryl did her best to work with police sketch artists and came up with this rendering. The sketch went around the neighborhood, but no one recognized the suspect. Detectives then turned to finding Sharon Pryor. 3 days later, on April 1st, a local beekeeper's neighbor called and said that one of his gates to his far pastures was open. He hopped in his truck and went to investigate. Snow was still on the ground, and it was still too early for him to be opening up the hives, so during the winter months, he didn't really bother with checking his fields routinely. When he got to the gate, he noticed it was indeed open. The gate had a padlock on it, but he never actually clicked the lock down. It appeared that someone had come by, popped open the gate, and driven onto his field. He followed the tire tracks, initially assuming some kids had gone onto the property to joyride, but then instead discovered something shocking. In some bushes, what looked to be a pile of clothes, a suede jacket, but in the clothes was the body of the missing teen, Sharon Pryor. Sharon was found naked from the waist down. Her jeans and underwear were recovered 5 feet from her body, caught in a bush. Detectives, as well as a medical examiner, believed that she'd been deceased for 1 or 2 days before she was discovered, coming to the conclusion that someone had held her captive for the weekend before dumping her body in the field. Her cause of death was blood aspiration. She had been severely beaten. Her autopsy showed that she had a fractured jaw, a broken nose, and multiple broken ribs. At the crime scene, footprints were also recovered near Sharon's body. The impression was photographed and preserved. The tire tracks in the snow were also very clear, giving detectives a good idea of what type of vehicle they were looking for. A man's shirt had also been used to bind Sharon's hands, and tape had been used to cover her mouth. Based on the footprint impressions and the size of the shirt, they believed they were looking for a man around 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, which matched the body type of Cheryl Roy's attacker. Despite the rigorous investigation and countless tips, detectives weren't able to locate the man that had attacked Cheryl, nor identify the suspect that abducted and murdered Sharon, though always believing it was likely the same suspect. Law enforcement even put out a $10,000 reward for information. However, without a suspect, the case eventually went cold. In 2004, the case was reopened with the help of a tip. Detectives began to investigate a neighbor that lived a few doors down from the Pryor family. Detectives tore apart the garage on the property, believing it had likely been a garage near the abduction site that Sharon had been kept in for up to 3 days before she was killed. The garage was behind an apartment building and had been used to house garden and building maintenance tools of the building owner. With Sharon's murder occurring just before spring, it seemed like a perfect location to hide a kidnapped individual, knowing no one would need to come into the garage until the snow melted. They tore apart the building, even digging deep down into the soil below, looking for anything that might indicate Sharon had been there, but nothing was found. Likely too much time had passed, and again the case went cold. In 2023, new detectives opted to reopen the Sharon Pryor investigation, looking towards genetic genealogy to find answers. They started the investigation from scratch, finding male DNA on the male shirt that had been used to bind Sharon's hands, as well as on her clothing. They sent the DNA off to genetic genealogists, who were able to slowly piece together the unknown man's family tree. One surname popped up, Romine, and law enforcement started to look into prior arrests around the time of Sharon's murder, and a suspect's name turned up with a lengthy criminal history in both Canada and the United States. Franklin Maywood Romine. Born in 1946 in West Virginia, Romine had started his criminal career as early as 16, starting with petty theft and destruction of property, escalating to a vehicle theft at 18, and going all the way to breaking and entering, stalking, and sexual assault in his 20s.
What's amazing about the case is we found this guy, and he probably never gave a DNA sample in his life.
In the decades of investigation and countless tips, suspects, and interviews, Canadian detectives say Romine's name had never come up until last year when a DNA profile that was removed from that blue t-shirt and Sharon's underwear and pants made it possible to target the last name of the suspect.
Then they got the name Romine, so then they just started looking at their criminal records. Well, they see this guy being very active in Canada and Montreal in the 70s, right? Violent activity, in and out of jail, and then.
He had previously been incarcerated in 1964, but escaped prison and fled to Canada. He frequently bounced between Canada and West Virginia, racking up warrants in both countries. In 1975, he had been meant to be in prison in the US, but had fled to Canada in between sentencing hearings. In that case, he had stalked a waitress who had turned him down, broke into her house, and sexually assaulted her at knife point. Between the constant fleeing the country and escaping prison, it's unclear why he'd been released to the public, but who knows. Months after Sharon's attacks in Montreal, he'd been arrested by local authorities and extradited back to the US, where he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He served 6 in prison before being released. He died in Canada in 1982 at the age of 36, and it's unclear how he died. His death certificate was never discovered, and his body was sent back to the US for burial. He was buried next to his mother in Putnam County. Cold case detectives reached out to Romine's living relatives, which included surviving brothers. His brothers weren't surprised that he was being investigated for murder. One of his brothers said that he had been estranged from the family years before his death. Franklin's brother was a Marine, and while overseas, Franklin had attacked his brother's wife, trying to sexually assault her. After that, the rest of his family had nothing to do with him. Franklin Romine was known to be unpredictable, violent, and aggressive. He had never been a suspect in Sharon's case, though he bore a striking resemblance to the police sketch that Cheryl provided to law enforcement. At the time of the murder, he was 28 and lived 9 kilometers or 5 miles from the prior home. The tire tracks in the original investigation were also matched to a vehicle that Romine had purchased while in Montreal, and the footprint found at the crime scene also matched his shoe size. Detectives petitioned to have Romine exhumed, though his family protested legally. While they had provided DNA to give a familial match, they didn't want their mother's grave disturbed. They felt that with the proximity of Franklin's grave to their mother's, it would be impossible to exhume one without disturbing the other. But the judge ultimately approved the exhumation. DNA was extracted from the remains uncovered and was tested against the DNA in Sharon's cold case, and it was a 99% match. Romine's DNA has been entered into federal databases in both Canada and the US, and his DNA is now being tested against multiple cold case murder victims. The FBI has also stepped in and is working with law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border to assist in determining any potential victims with similar circumstances. Sharon's mother, Yvonne, now 86, as well as Sharon's twin sisters, were given the news that her murder was finally solved after 48 years. They attended the press conference and spoke about who Sharon was before her murder, as well as thanking detectives for solving her cold case.
It's hard to know where to start. We will start by saying how hard it was sitting through today's police presentation of Sharon's case, as it brought back many difficult memories once again. We are still grieving the loss of our daughter and sister, who was savagely murdered at the age of 16, March 29, 1975. Life has not been easy for us since then, but Sharon has given us strength for the past 48 years, and especially today. Sharon is here beside us.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing another cold case solved by DNA, and this time another serial killer who may have been active in the late 70s and 80s has possibly been identified. Let's get into it. 19-year-old Cheryl Thompson was described as a sweet and kind woman by her friends and family. In early 1978, Cheryl was a student at the University of Cincinnati and was in her first year of her studies. Cheryl had taken well to student life and made lots of friends. Like most students, Cheryl liked to unwind at local bars and clubs when not studying or attending classes. In March 1978, tragedy would befall the Thompson family, and it would take 4 decades before the family finally got some answers. The end of March 1978 marked the beginning of spring break. Droves of students left their dorms and studies behind to spend the next week or two soaking up the sunshine and letting their hair down. For Cheryl Thompson, spring break meant only one thing: family time. She made the short trip from her dorm at the University of Cincinnati to her parents' house in Oakley, a suburb of Cincinnati. She spent the first part of the week with her family and also used the time to catch up with old friends. The high school buddies discussed what college was like for them and what their futures may look like. It was a Friday night on March 24, 1978. Cheryl spent most of the day at the family home before deciding to hit the bars of Oakley. There was a disco at Gatsby's Bar, and Cheryl agreed to meet her boyfriend there. At 10:30 p.m., Cheryl left the house, saying goodbye to her little brother Danny. Shortly before leaving, Cheryl received a call from her friend Laura Bressert, who had initially agreed to attend the disco, but at the last minute, Laura backed out and even begged Cheryl to follow suit. Laura would later tell news outlets, quote, "I begged her on the phone not to go because I had a bad feeling." Cheryl ignored Laura's advice and headed for the bar. By midnight, Cheryl's boyfriend had become worried. Cheryl had never arrived at the bar and had an uneasy feeling overcome him. He began to search the bar and walked the entire route from the bar to Cheryl's parents' house, but there was no sign of her. News outlets reported that Cheryl's boyfriend found her car parked on a street close to the bar. According to the news, the boyfriend collected a second pair of keys from Cheryl's brother and, quote, moved it to a legal parking space and continued his search. At around 5:30 a.m., he spotted something bizarre. Cruising down the road was a strange-looking man. When Cheryl's boyfriend looked again, he realized the man was driving Cheryl's car. He began chasing the man on foot but was unsuccessful, losing the car near Hyde Park Plaza. The bizarre events of the evening had left Cheryl's boyfriend reeling, and by early morning he had arrived at her parents' house to tell them the bad news. Cheryl's parents knew something was amiss when she failed to return home that morning, finding that her bed had not been slept in. Her parents were faced with the difficult task of reporting their daughter missing. The Loveland Police Department arrived at the Thompson home to take statements and evidence, and the search for Cheryl began. Officers retraced Cheryl's steps but found no sign of her. There was no evidence to suggest that she'd ever made it to the bar, so where was she? The University of Cincinnati confirmed that Cheryl never made it to any of her classes once spring break was over. Investigators did not believe that Cheryl had run away. Law enforcement found her vehicle parked near the bar the next day. The car, other than being abandoned, showed no signs of anything suspicious. 2 weeks later, on April 8, 1978, a state natural resource officer, Mike Surio, was making his rounds on the bank of the Little Miami River close to E. Kemper Road. He was looking for the owners of 2 cars parked near the riverbank. It was his job to make sure anyone fishing in the area had the correct licenses. It was as he was walking that he saw something in the brush. It was a foot. Upon further examination, he realized it was the body of a woman. The Loveland Police Department was immediately summoned to the scene, and everyone's worst fears were confirmed. The police confirmed that the body belonged to the missing 19-year-old Cheryl Thompson, and she'd been found partially clothed before being dumped close to the river. The Hamilton County Chief's Deputy Coroner, Dr. Paul Jolly, performed Cheryl's autopsy. In his report, he noted that Cheryl had suffered blunt force trauma to the head and had been strangled and sexually assaulted. The brutality of Cheryl's death shocked her family as well as the residents of Oakley. Cheryl had been an average 19-year-old university student. Who would want to harm her and why? Residents tightened their security measures, and women were more cautious of unknown men. Cheryl Thompson's brutal murder wasn't the only one that rocked Hamilton as well as surrounding counties. In 1978, shortly after Cheryl's body had been discovered, news reports began connecting Cheryl's case to others in the area. According to this report, at least 15 other girls and women were found murdered between 1976 and 1978, all under similar circumstances. The list reported goes as follows: Lisa Jansen, 12 years old. Charmaine Stola, 17 years old. Nancy Ann Theobald, 18 years old. Diane Sue McRoby, 16 years old. Elaine Bear, 15 years old. Nancy Gritsby, 23 years old. Victoria Hincher, 24 years old. Dorothy Sullivan, 18 years old. Linda Dyer, 15 years old. Mary Ruth Hopkins, 21 years old. Carol Sue Klabler, 16 years old. Unidentified, 25. Susan Gorman, 19 years old. Linda K. Harmon, 17 years old. Cora Ellen Durham, 27 years old. Hamilton residents feared a serial killer was on the loose, and nobody knew who could be next. In 1978, DNA evidence was not yet available. However, the coroner, Dr. Jolly, and crime scene investigators obtained swabs from Cheryl's body to preserve for future use. One of these swabs was what was now commonly referred to as a sexual assault kit. Dr. Jolly could not establish an exact time of death, although he believed she'd been there for around 3 days. Cheryl had been missing for much longer than 3 days, so what had happened to her during that time? Cheryl's boyfriend was thoroughly interrogated and questioned, and he was eventually dropped as a possible suspect. Investigators combed through mountains of paperwork looking for a golden clue, but Cheryl's case quickly turned cold. For decades, the swab kit sat in paper bags in the evidence locker of the Loveland Police Department office. Cheryl's murder left a hole in her family's lives. She never finished her degree, started a family, or bought a home. The anniversary of her murder was a painful reminder to her family. In 2012, a glimmer of hope came when the Loveland PD decided to reopen the case. The DNA samples that had been sitting on shelves were once again analyzed. This analysis led to the discovery of a partial DNA profile. The profile was submitted to CODIS, but unfortunately there were no matches. Loveland investigators felt that they were back to square one. They now had a DNA profile, but needed help figuring out who it belonged to. In 2012, the Loveland PD decided to submit the swab to a third-party ancestry database after seeing the success that it had brought to cases such as the Golden State Killer. The exact company used was not specified. When these DNA samples were sent off for analysis, the company took just a few weeks to narrow it down to a single family tree. A brother, cousin, and an uncle from this family agreed to submit to a DNA test, which eventually ruled them out as suspects. Genealogists were able to tick off male members of the family until they reached one name: Ralph Howell. Howell had been employed as a delivery truck driver for the Cincinnati Enquirer and was an over-the-road truck driver. Ralph had died in 1985 in a car crash, but his criminal history cemented him as a primary suspect. 2 years before his death, in 1983, Howell picked up a woman on the side of the road under the pretense that he would drive her home. Shortly after entering the vehicle, Howell pounced on the woman, throwing a rope around her neck and strangling her. Fortunately, the woman was able to escape and reported the incident to the police. Disturbingly, Howell was able to negotiate his charges, eventually settling on the charges of unlawful restraint, which was a misdemeanor. Howell was now free to do as he pleased, knowing that he would only be sentenced to misdemeanor charges. Investigators believe that this was not Howell's first crime, but it was the first time he'd been caught. In the wake of the DNA analysis, Ralph Howell's body was exhumed and a sample of his DNA was obtained from his jawbone. This sample was sequenced, and in November 2022, the Loveland Police Department, in cooperation with other agencies, posthumously charged Ralph Howell with sexual assault and murder of 19-year-old Cheryl Thompson. Whilst Ralph is no longer with us, this conviction brings some closure to Cheryl's family. Cheryl's brother Bill told the media in a statement on behalf of the family, quote, We are glad my sister's killer is dead and can't hurt anyone else. As a small family, we're still glad that they finally got some closure. Hamilton County Prosecutor Joe Dieters told the media,
"There's no doubt in our mind that Ralph Howell was a serial killer."
Along with the murder of Cheryl Thompson, Ralph is believed to have murdered 17-year-old Charmaine Stola, murdered in 1978, 18-year-old Nancy Ann Theobald, murdered in 1977, and 24-year-old Victoria Hincher, murdered in 1976. Unfortunately, DNA was not recovered from these victims at the time of their murder, making it unlikely that law enforcement will be able to positively link Ralph Howell to the murders conclusively. However, due to the circumstances of all three murders and their closeness to Cheryl's murder, they are confident that all four are connected. At this time, it is unclear if the Loveland PD will go forward in trying to exhume these victims. Due to his employment in the trucking industry, law enforcement has stated that there may be other victims outside of the region where Howell lived. They will go forward and submit his DNA nationally to see if there are any more victims connected to him.
Now that we're here and you have some closure, how does this feel for you?
No, it feels incredible. I mean, I never thought this would happen.
Bill Thompson finally got the answers he's been waiting more than 4 decades for.
I'd moved on. I didn't think there was any way this was ever going to be solved.
Anyone with information about Ralph Howell's movements or any of the cases mentioned are asked to contact the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation at 855-224-6446. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 3 more recently solved cold cases. Let's get into it. Number 1. Lena Reyes Gides. On April 20th, 1998, a couple was hiking in Maidenwater Spring when they came across something on Highway 276 in Garfield County, Utah. They found a body, and both Park Services and the Garfield County Sheriff's Department arrived on the scene. They found a woman wrapped in plastic bags, duct taped, put in a blue sleeping bag, then rolled in a carpet tied with rope. Authorities believed she had been strategically placed to be found. During the autopsy, she was determined to have been between 32 and 45 years old, with brown hair and brown eyes. She weighed approximately 110 pounds. She had been shot in the back of the head execution style, and the killer had removed the tips of the fingers post-mortem. It was also noted that the body had frozen due to the below freezing temperatures the day before the body had been found. Authorities had not been able to identify the victim. She would be called Maidenwater victim Jane Doe, and the case would go cold. The case would eventually be handed to the Utah State Bureau of Investigation. Utah Bureau agent Brian Davies did a press conference in 2018 trying to identify the Maidenwater Jane Doe. In October 2018, the Utah Department of Public Safety released a press conference asking for help identifying the victim. This press release also stated that they had considered serial killer Scott Kimball as a suspect and had yet to rule him out. This case had similarities to Kimball's other victims, but he denied involvement. Unknown to the Utah authorities, but around the same time as this press release, Ohio authorities were updating pictures of their missing persons database. A California true crime enthusiast saw the pictures of the missing person database and felt the connection to photos that had been released of the Maidenwater victim. He got in contact with Davies, saying that he should look into this missing person case. They reviewed both cases, and both Davies and the Ohio authorities confirmed that they looked very similar and had a similar mole. They believed they might have found the victim's identity and had 2 family members come up and take DNA tests. In a November 28 press release 20 years after the body was found, the Utah DPS confirmed the victim as missing 37-year-old Lena Reyes Gides. Lena had gone missing in 1998 when she left for a trip from her home with her husband, Edward Gides, to visit family in Mexico. She was supposed to travel through a Texas airport, but there was no record of her ever getting on any flights that day. She was reported missing 5 months later by her husband. Lena was a ballerina when she first met her husband in New Mexico, and they got married in '96 and moved to Youngstown, Ohio 6 months later. Now that they had identified Lena, they kept working on who her killer might be. Davis started looking back at the evidence, specifically at the rope she'd been tied in. With advances in DNA, they could use a technology that allowed them to extract DNA from a difficult surface, like a rope. They did find 2 male samples of DNA. One was ruled out as the knot expert they had used previously to see if a special knot had been used. The other sample made them look back at Lena's husband, Edward. In 1998, Lena's husband had been the primary suspect during her disappearance because it had taken so long for her to be reported missing. He was brought in for questioning with law enforcement in October of '98, where he talked about a blue sleeping bag she was bringing as a gift, the last time he had seen her dropping her off at the airport, saying he didn't go in with her, and that she was planning on paying for the reserved ticket in cash.
The morning, Wednesday morning, April 8th.
When she made the reservations from Pittsburgh, she made it from the house, she called?
Yeah.
Do you know what flight company, what plane?
I thought it was a U.S. Air flight that I gave you.
U.S. Air. Now, at that point, she made the reservations. Did she pay for the ticket? How did she pay
She was going to pay cash for the ticket at the airport.
No, okay, so you make reservations and then
Yeah,
you pay
I told her to
cash.
take credit card if she would take the credit card.
Unfortunately, Edward took his own life in 2001. Davies could not get a sample as he had been cremated after his death. Authorities then reached out to his living relatives asking for DNA samples. 2 came forward willingly and 1 had to get a search warrant. The DNA came back as a familial match. In June of 2022, law enforcement announced that the case was closed and that they had discovered Lena's killer, her husband, Edward Gides. After 20 years, she got her name back, and after 24 years, her family got to know what happened and who killed her. In a January 2019 press release, Lena's sister is quoted saying, "I'm very grateful for all your work. I felt like for 20 years no one would listen to me, but now I know what happened. I'm here to bring her home, not like I expected, but I'm bringing her back home with me." Number 2. Benny Scruggs. On July 17, 1985 at 3 a.m., a man called 911 from a trailer home on Travis Drive in Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin, saying that his neighbor had been stabbed. He was still alive but was bleeding heavily. The 911 dispatcher told him that they should put pressure on the wound and help was on the way. During the phone call, the neighbor said that the wife of the man who'd been stabbed had called him and asked for him to come over there quickly. He told the dispatcher that he was holding a knife. The dispatcher said to put it down. This was when the dispatcher could hear a female voice saying, "One of my knives is missing," and the man told the woman, "Hey Yvonne, go back there and apply pressure." When the Wisconsin Rapids police arrived, they found a man identified by the wife as Benny Scruggs on a waterbed of the trailer home covered in blood with a towel over the wound. When the ambulance arrived, the man was pronounced deceased at the scene. Benny Scruggs was 28 years old. He married Yvonne Koshaw on May 15, 1982, and they had 1 son together named Matthew. He worked as a baker at the Foodland East. An autopsy was performed with the cause of death being a single stab wound to the chest on the upper left-hand side. The wound had gone through his rib, into his lung, and almost out the back. The medical examiner was quoted as saying, "One hell of a big knife, like a butcher knife, and another 3/4 of an inch, and there would have been a hole in the waterbed." Police at the time interviewed surrounding neighbors, Yvonne, and the Scruggs' babysitter. The couple had been out the night before, and the babysitter had reported that they came home in better spirits than average around 1 a.m. On the other hand, during her 3 interviews that evening, Yvonne would give different versions of what had happened. During her first interview with detectives, Yvonne said that the babysitter had left, then she and Benny went to bed, him falling asleep right away and her lying awake. Then their 2-year-old son was crying. She went to his room for about 10 minutes before feeling something was off. When she went back to bed, she noticed a shovel was up against the fridge and the trailer door was open. That was strange because she always had a habit of locking the door. She then went to look for Benny and found him covered in blood. She then called the neighbor for help. In a second interview, only a few hours after the first, she said that they both fell asleep after the babysitter left and that their 2-year-old came into their bedroom crying. She then took the toddler to his bedroom for about 10 minutes and then noticed the shovel and the open back door on the way back. I checked in on Benny and then called the neighbor for help. During the second interview, Yvonne had stepped away for a moment. A detective overheard her talking to her friend, with her stating, "I was asleep next to him, he got stabbed, I don't know." During her final interview, she had said that they both fell asleep. She woke up to her 2-year-old crying and Benny throwing up. She took her son to his room and then went back to Benny. He was covered in blood and she called the neighbor. Detectives at the time believed that she was being uncooperative with their investigation. Police decided to drain a nearby pond in hopes of finding the missing murder weapon, but they did not find it in the pond. The alleged knife that Yvonne claimed was missing from the home was never found. Over the next few weeks, the authorities would interview neighbors, including Donald Meyer, who lived in a trailer just down the way with a woman and her child. Meyer would tell authorities that he'd previously had a sexual relationship with Yvonne when they worked together 4 or 5 years earlier. He also told police that Yvonne had a temper and that she probably killed her husband. He would continue to tell the police that he had not seen Yvonne again till the February of 1985, and that was about a week before Benny was stabbed. Yvonne had invited him over, Benny was not home, and they had sexual intercourse in the living room. And it was then that Yvonne had told him that if he wanted her, he knew how to get rid of Benny. Yvonne, in an August 1985 police interview, would confirm the sexual relationship with Meyer, saying that she didn't tell the police because she didn't think it was important, and that she was embarrassed to tell anyone. She did, however, deny saying anything about getting rid of Benny. After 1993, the case would go dormant until 2012. At that time, Donald Meyer would stack up a lengthy criminal history, and Yvonne would go on to get remarried. Donald Meyer was on trial for 10 counts of stalking jurors, who had convicted him in a 2006 trial for threatening a judge. Knowing this would mean adding time to his sentence, he reached out to the Wisconsin Police Department and asked to speak to someone about Benny Scruggs' murder. In this interview, Meyer would implicate Yvonne, saying that she was trying to set him up for Benny's murder. He would also go on to say that he'd been over multiple times, and that one time she took him into the bedroom so his fingerprints would be there. He also drew an intricate diagram of the trailer and knew facts about it, like the bedroom door would open and the trailer's back door was screwed shut. After this interview, detectives would interview other people who were around at the time of the murder. Some will remember talking to Yvonne about the murder in the following weeks or years. One witness said Yvonne had told them that she knew who killed Benny. And another said Yvonne had asked if she thought she had killed him, the witness asking, "Well, did you?" And Yvonne never answered. Another witness came forward after seeing an article in a newspaper in 2013 about Benny Scruggs' murder, saying her son had dated Yvonne between 1989 and 1990 while she was married to her new husband, who is now deceased. The witness said Yvonne said she loved both men, with the witness saying something like, "You can't have it both ways." According to them, Yvonne's answer was, "I killed one husband, I can kill another." The son, who was also in this interview, said that he had asked where the father of her child was, her answer being, "He's not with us anymore." He asked what happened, and she answered, "Well, I killed him." She also said that she was drunk that night and didn't remember much. In 2013, detectives interviewed some of Meyer's fellow inmates. Those inmates said that Meyer liked to talk about how he'd been in an ongoing relationship with Yvonne around the time of the murder. That Yvonne had instructed him to throw the murder weapon in the garbage so it would be picked up in the morning by trash collection. Yvonne died in 2015 of acute alcohol poisoning. It was never formally accused or charged with murder. More years would pass before any further progress on Betty Scruggs' murder investigation. In 2017, an inmate would tell detectives that Meyer had told him he had committed the murder, that he had done it because Yvonne had refused to be with him till her husband was dead. The same inmate had overheard him talking to someone on the phone about the murder. Police obtained the recording of the phone call. In 2022, Donald Meyer, now 60 years old, was charged with the murder of Benny Scruggs. In September 2022, he refused to come out of his cell for his preliminary hearing and refused to work with his public defender. In December, Meyer's public defender tried to get him a new preliminary hearing, but the judge said that they would not reward bad behavior. Meyer was present for this hearing and pleaded not guilty. His trial is currently set up for a video conference in April 2023. It is during this trial we will find out what evidence law enforcement has against Meyer. However, regardless of the circumstances, he either perpetrated the murder or helped Yvonne cover up a murder case for 4 decades. Number 3. Jennifer Brinkman. On March 24, 1998, in Marysville, Washington, a father returned home from vacation with his girlfriend to find his 19-year-old daughter deceased in her bedroom. The girl was Jennifer Brinkman, who was supposed to be on this vacation, but last minute had decided to stay home. An autopsy would later show that she'd been hit in the neck by an axe. News reports from 98 would say that they didn't find the murder weapon, but more recent reports say that the axe was found at the crime scene. Authorities at the time also collected other evidence and DNA samples. Jennifer was described as a social person known to walk around Marysville, to strike up conversations with strangers. She often used telephone, dating, and chat lines, which were used frequently in the 90s, to chat and connect with strangers. She was also known to use library computers to access online chat rooms. The Marysville Police Department would send in the evidence to the crime lab, but they were unable to get any matches to anything, and DNA was not as advanced as it is today. Jennifer's case would eventually go cold, and the case would move from detective to detective, but the Marysville police never forgot her. As DNA advanced, they were able to get a DNA sample that didn't belong to Jennifer, individual A, but they didn't have anyone to compare the sample to. The Marysville Police Department eventually partnered with Virginia-based Parabon Nanolabs. They would use genetic genealogy and publicly offered profiles to find a potential list of suspects. One of these suspects had already been on their radar for years. The suspect had been a person of interest Jennifer had talked to on one of the chat lines, and the suspect had sent a letter to Jennifer just prior to her death. But when the suspect had previously interviewed earlier in the investigation, he denied ever knowing or having contact with Jennifer. With this advanced DNA analysis, they could get a search warrant for the suspect's DNA. With the warrant, he volunteered his DNA willingly, and it was an exact match. He was arrested in November 2022 with first-degree murder. In November, the Marysville Police Department held a press conference announcing that they had arrested a suspect, a 52-year-old man. They did not reveal his name at that time. The police said that they are still getting all of the pieces together. In this press conference, they said that the letter had wording that implied that they had met before. The suspect lived only 3 miles from Jennifer's mother's house, but they didn't know if they had met in the past while Jennifer visited her mother. The suspect would have been 28 years old at the time of Jennifer's murder. They said that the suspect had used his right to remain silent, and that they may never get an answer to the motive. Since the murder, he has worked and lived as a hermit, and he is not suspected in any other murders, nor evidence that he is connected to any other crimes. After 24 years, they could tell Jennifer's mother that they had found who did this. The press conference revealed that Jennifer's mother was extremely emotional. She cried and was very thankful for the work that was put into her case. Jennifer's father passed away in 2013. There may never be answers as to why this happened, but the family can hopefully find some justice for Jennifer. The suspect is currently being held on charges of first-degree murder in Snohomish County Jail. At this time, there are no further announcements on the next court dates or when his identity will be released to the public. Bye for now.
A suspected serial killer has been found guilty of murdering a Portland teenager nearly 50 years ago.
A Clark County jury did conclude DNA evidence tied Warren Forrest to the murder of 17-year-old Martha Morrison back in 1974.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 3 more recently solved cold cases. Let's get into it. Number 3. Martha Morrison and Carol Platt Valenzuela. It was on October 12, 1974. The remains of 2 people were found in the dense woods of the Dole Valley in Clark County, Washington by a hunting party. Because the bodies had been placed on the ground, the elements and wildlife made it hard to determine a cause of death. It was investigated as a homicide. One of the victims was identified quickly through dental records. The victim's name was Carol Platt Valenzuela. She was 18 years old and had been reported missing by her husband on August 4, 1974. She was last seen hitchhiking in Vancouver, Washington on August 2nd, and she left behind twins that were only 10 months old when she went missing. The other remains could not be identified at the time, and it was determined that the remains were female, aged between 17 and 25. Newspapers from 1974 said that law enforcement believed that the 2 women were murdered, but that could not say when they had been killed due to the elements that had affected their remains. Women could have been killed at different times and were most likely dumped, not killed, at the location they were found. The case would go cold quickly. The operation manager at the Clark County Medical Examiner, Nikki Costa, discovered in 2007 that the unidentified remains from the 1974 case had been mislabeled. The label was the case number for Carol Platt. It was believed that this was a clinical error, but it cost them decades to identify this woman. In 2012, the remains were sent to the Bob Cellmark Forensics for DNA analysis. Around the same time in 2010, a woman named Rita Morrison and her half-brother started to look into what happened to their sister, Martha Morrison. She went to look into the missing persons report that she thought had been filed, but at this point, Reba discovered that there were no records that a missing persons report had ever been made in 1974 for her sister. Martha Morrison was 17 years old, 5'4", about 140 pounds, with long brown hair and hazel eyes. She'd been in foster care with her sister and was known to run away occasionally. Her mother had been deaf, and Reba was reported that she was skilled at sign language. At some point between 1973 and 1974, Martha lived in Phoenix, Arizona, where she attended Jobs Corps training and on-the-job training program. There she met another student, and they moved in together in mid-1974 at Portland, Oregon. The man, believed to be her boyfriend, had worked at the shipyards as a welder. In September 1974, she left their apartment after a fight with a suitcase and was never seen again. In 2013, after Reba and her brother gave DNA, and it was sent to the University of North Texas in the hopes of getting answers. They got a potential match to the unidentified woman from 1974. The Clark County Medical Examiner would need more DNA from family members for a more accurate DNA analysis. They tested the DNA they had from Martha's mother, which also showed the DNA consistent but inconclusive to the unidentified woman. Martha's father died in 1976, but in 2015 they exhumed his body, hoping to get DNA. They got a definitive answer that the unidentified woman from 1974 was 99.9% Martha Morrison. Her case and Carol's were still open and unsolved at this time. Then, in 2015, Martha's DNA would be found on a piece of evidence.
She said that she was just waiting for us to get to the answer. So she had no doubt in her gut, and is obviously both of her and her brother are relieved to have the final answer.
The Washington State Police started to look at evidence from a case of a suspected serial killer in the hopes of finding something to close unsolved cases. they found an unknown female DNA profile on an air pistol, and in 2015, they matched this DNA to Martha Morrison. In 2019, Warren Forrest was arrested for the first-degree murder of Martha. Warren Forrest had been incarcerated since 1974 when he was arrested after he brutally assaulted and left a woman for dead. In 1979, he went to trial for murder and was convicted. He has since been accused of several other murders and is suspected of being a serial killer. In January 2020, Forrest pleaded not guilty, and his trial was supposed to start in April 2020. His trial was pushed several times after that because of COVID-19. His trial started at the end of January 2023. On February 1st, the jury convicted Forrest after only 90 minutes of deliberation. On February 17th, Warren Forrest received his second life sentence. He remains a prime suspect in at least 5 other homicide cases, including Carol Valenzuela.
When the judge came out and said at 5:04 that it's now 5:04 and I have been informed that the jury has reached a verdict, we all kind of looked at each other and said, it can only be one thing. It can only be that.
It isn't about just killing Martha. It's about all the rest of us that have had to deal with this for years and years. You know, I mean, that's hard on people.
If you would like me to cover these cases more, please comment down below. Number 2, Peter J. Kima Jr. The short life of 6-year-old Peter K. Kima Jr. was filled with abuse, pain, and anguish. Born to parents Peter Kima Sr. and Jaylene Maureen Ackle Kima, on May 1, 1991, Peter was subjected to abuse and cruelty from that day forward. Shortly after his birth, Child Protective Services became involved with the Kima family after a family member made a report. Baby Peter was found to have a broken arm and leg along with healed fractures. His siblings were also found to have suffered multiple injuries at the hands of their parents, and Peter was placed with his grandparents, James and Yolanda Ackle. In 1995, when Peter was 4 years old, CPS placed him back with his parents despite evidence of fractures, healed fractures, black eyes, and other injuries. According to one report, Peter had suffered a spinal fracture, which can only occur when the limb is twisted until the breaking point. Peter's siblings often took the fall for his injuries, and his mother, Jaylene, said that Peter had broken his leg when his sister had jumped on him. His grandparents, James and Yolanda, filed multiple reports, but CPS failed to act. Jaylene and Peter Sr. were determined to keep them away from their grandchildren, and when they were allowed to see them, they described them as looking frail and injured. James and Yolanda saw Peter for the last time in 1996. They fought the courts for custody, but for some reason, they always sided with the parents. According to reports, testimony from Peter's siblings said that he once sustained a wound so deep that someone could put a finger inside of it. In 1997, the family moved out of their Nanawhale Estates home, most likely to escape the grips of CPS. Once they moved, there was little room for outside intervention, as Peter had been enrolled in kindergarten, but his absences quickly got him removed from their system. This allowed Peter and Jaylene to get away with their abuse even longer. Shortly after Peter's 1991 hospital admission, CPS ordered a psychological evaluation on Peter and Jaylene and reported that they had, quote, potential for abusive parenting. One support worker even wrote about Peter's explosive anger, yet nothing was done to remove the children from their care. The extent to which Peter Jr. suffered cannot be understated. His siblings would later tell their foster parents that Peter had been shot with BB guns, thrown out of a window, forced to eat dog feces, and made to sleep outside without a mattress or blanket. There are many more details of what Peter was forced to endure in his short life, and most of them are too graphic and heartbreaking to mention. The abuse against Peter would come to an end on April 26, 1998, when Jaylene Kima filed a missing persons report for her 6-year-old son. She told the Elo police that she had not seen her son since August 1997, when Peter Jr. and Sr. left Elo for Honolulu. Peter Sr. later told investigators that he took his son to Honolulu while looking for employment. The two lived in a tent in Ala Park, but Peter Sr. had other arrangements in mind. This is where discrepancies begin to creep in. Peter Sr. told the Hawaii County Police Department that on August 11, 1997, he signed over custody of his son to Rose McQuackane, a family friend he called Auntie. The two had agreed to exchange custody of Peter Jr. as the Kimas could no longer provide for him. Interestingly, the signed agreement that Peter Sr. produced was dated April 11, 1997, not August. So where had Peter been in that 1 month gap? Investigators knew that Peter Sr.'s story was suspicious, but lacked evidence. A year after Peter Jr. was reported missing, his 3 siblings were removed from their parents' care after further allegations of physical and other abuses.
And I also wanted to know if anybody's seen my Auntie Rose, because that's the last person I gave my son to.
When the police pressed Peter Sr. and Jalen for Rose's contact information or address, they could not provide it. There was no government documents or anyone by that name. Peter Jr.'s siblings, Lena, Chantel, and Alan, were interviewed by the police in the wake of his disappearance, and they provided some very disturbing information. They detailed abuse that they'd been subjected to daily. Lena, who was just 4 years old when her brother disappeared, told the police and the accompanying therapist that she had seen Peter chained and thrown into a bin. Later, she saw his lifeless body being placed into a box that had been taken to Honolulu by Peter Sr.
Spanks, smacks, sticks, belt, get slammed on the ground, thrown in the wall.
Did he abuse all the kids equally? Was it the same punishment?
No, Peter Boy got the most of it, unfortunately.
Why?
I couldn't tell you why. It was just the way it was.
I never really got to see Peter Boy either. He was either in the trunk when we were going out to the stores or something.
Why was he in the trunk?
I'm not even sure. Our dad said that he was being punished for doing something bad. We'd go to the beach and he'd be in the trunk. We'd go to the store, he'd be in the trunk. I seen, at the time I seen my mom going over my brother. What it looked like he was, she was trying to kiss him. And then I saw my dad trying to beat on his chest. And I opened the door more because the door was cracked, and they just yelled at me and they just told me to go back to sleep.
Lena later realized her parents were doing CPR on her brother.
When I woke up, I asked them, "Oh, where's Peter Boy?" They said that, "Oh, Peter Boy went to Honolulu to stay with his auntie." I knew they were lying, and they said, "Go look in the house, go look in the house." I looked in the closet and there was this box. Then I came out and I told them, I was like, "Peter Boy's in the box, he's playing hide and seek." He didn't move. He was just in the fetal position in the box. It looked like he was sleeping.
Her statements were taken with a pinch of salt due to her age, but investigators believe Peter Jr. did not arrive in Honolulu alive.
We're trying to tie up some other loose ends, and then we'll meet again. We'll meet and confer with the lead prosecutor, and we're hopeful that this case will eventually reach the courtroom.
In 2016, Jalen and Peter Sr. were arrested and charged in their son's disappearance. The indictment stated that the investigators believed Peter had passed away due to a failure to seek medical attention. CBS reported that the family had health insurance, but Jalen did not take him to the hospital because she feared Peter Sr. would be arrested. The indictment also noted that Peter likely succumbed to septic shock. Lena revealed that she had witnessed Jalen trying to resuscitate Peter Jr. before his body had been placed into the box. Jalen was sentenced to serve 1 year with credit for time served in exchange for her testimony against Peter Sr. Jalen would pass away in 2019. Peter Sr. was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The courts have offered him a deal where he will serve a minimum of 6 years if he leads investigators to Peter's body. Over the years, he has given conflicting statements, and his version of events has changed significantly. He recently told investigators that he threw Peter Jr.'s ashes into the ocean on the Puna coast off of Highway 137, close to Mackenzie State Park. Unfortunately, multiple searches have come up empty-handed, and investigators fear that they may never uncover the truth of what happened to little Peter Kima Jr. Peter's case has become infamous across Hawaii, with the media referring to him as Peter Boy. Peter is still considered missing, as his remains have never been retrieved. He is described as a multiracial male with Filipino, Spanish, Chinese, and Native Hawaiian background, with black hair, brown eyes, 4 feet tall, and 50 pounds. Anyone with information on Peter's case is asked to contact Captain Greg Esteban of the Hawaii Police Department. Number 1. Lisa Fracassi. It was on November 3, 1994, when a housekeeper for the Honolulu Prince Hotel was making her rounds. She noted that Unit 206 and recalled seeing a Do Not Disturb sign on the door for the last 3 days, but really needed to check the room. She knocked several times, but there was no answer. She had opted to just drop some towels off near the door and unlock the room. It was then that she made a grisly discovery. Inside was a deceased woman, and she called the police. The victim was discovered to be the long-term resident of the apartment, 37-year-old Lisa Fracassi. She had lived in the building for 6 months. She had last been seen Halloween night, and experts determined that she had likely died that same evening. Initially, detectives believed that Lisa's death had been a suicide, but her autopsy determined that she had been strangled to death. Detectives interviewed neighbors, but no one remembered any strange noises that would indicate someone had been in distress. But one neighbor recalled seeing a man leave Lisa's apartment in the early morning hours, but couldn't remember any distinguishing characteristics of the man. Detectives began to look back into Lisa's life to try and find her killer. Lisa had recently broken up with her boyfriend, an ex-cop, and he'd quickly been cleared as a suspect. Friends of Lisa didn't know anyone in her life that would have killed her, but she kept a wide group of friends. Lisa was incredibly caring and a giving person. If someone she knew was in trouble, she was the kind of person to drop everything and support that person. She could always be relied upon for charitable events. She volunteered her time to help others constantly. Lisa had wanted to be a nurse, and those who knew her knew that that would have been a career she could have excelled in. Originally from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, she had started her nursing degree, but needed to upgrade some schooling to practice nursing in Hawaii. While she was saving for nursing school, she worked as an exotic dancer. It was her job as a dancer which sent detectives looking for any signs of a stalker or someone she had met from her place of work, but still, nothing came up. Photographs and DNA evidence were collected from the crime scene, but never matched any of their suspects, and over time, Lisa's murder case went cold. In 2018, the HPD launched a campaign to deal with numerous unsolved murders, and in 2020, Lisa's case was put forward by the Honolulu PD for further genetic testing. With the help of the Hawaii Department of the Attorney General, they received the funding required to send a sample of DNA to Parabon Nanolabs. Parabon worked on the case for years, and in April 2022, they announced that they had found Lisa's killer. Cecil H. Trent had been 29 at the time of the murder and was a long-time resident of Hawaii but was originally from Michigan. However, there would never be justice for Lisa, as Trent died in 2013 of congestive heart failure at the age of 48. Trent had never been a suspect in the initial investigation, and little is known about how or why he killed Lisa Fracassi. Little is known about Trent. He was a retired driver, according to his obituary. At this time, it is unclear if they are looking for additional victims connected to Cecil Trent. Lisa's friends and family are relieved to have some answers. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing the 25-year-old murder case of Julie Jensen. Her husband had been fighting a lengthy legal battle to keep a letter detailing her suspicions that he was trying to kill her from coming to light. But it looks like there's now been justice for Julie. Let's get into it. On December 3rd, 1998, a woman named Julie Jensen was found deceased in her bed by her husband. At first, the police considered it a suicide, but the events following her death brought other things to light. Julie was 40 years old at the time of her death. She'd been married to her husband, Mark Jensen, since April 14th, 1984. The couple had 2 sons together, David, who was 8, and Douglas, who was 3 years old in 1998. Julie was a stay-at-home mother and had previously studied nursing before she had kids. She was originally from Kenosha, Wisconsin, and had 5 brothers, one of whom had passed away before her death. She lived in Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin with her family. Julie seemed to have a very happy and successful life. She was married to a successful stockbroker and had recently been promoted and had 2 beautiful children. But in the years before her death, behind the scenes, the relationship between Julie and Mark had started to deteriorate. Few people knew what Julie's marriage was really like. Few people saw what kind of person Mark was behind closed doors. On the day Julie's body was found, a neighbor Julie was close with went to law enforcement and delivered a letter. This letter had been handwritten by Julie and given to the neighbor 2 weeks before her death. The letter stated, quote, "I took this picture, and I am writing this on Saturday, November 21st, 98 at 7 a.m. This list was in my husband's business daily planner, not meant for me to see. I don't know what it means, but if anything happens to me, he would be my first suspect. Our relationship has deteriorated to the polite superficial. I know he's never forgiven me for the brief affair I had with that creep 7 years ago. Mark lives for work and the kids. He's an avid surfer of the internet. Anyways, I do not smoke or drink. My mother was an alcoholic, so I limit my drinking to 1 or 2 a week. Mark wants me to drink more with him on the evenings. I don't. I would never take my life because of my kids. They are everything to me. I regularly take Tylenol and multivitamins, occasionally OTC stuff for colds, Zantac, or Imodium. I have 1 prescription for migraine tablets, which Mark uses more than I. I pray I'm wrong and nothing happens, but I'm suspicious of Mark's behaviors and fear for my early demise. However, I will not leave David and Douglas. For number 14-1380, my life's greatest love, accomplishments, and wish. My 3 Ds, Daddy, David, Douglas." Experts later compared the letter from past samples of Julie's writing, and they can confirm that she did, in fact, write the letter. This letter was not the only time she had hinted at her husband being the cause if she was ever to be found dead. She had left 2 separate voicemails for Officer Ron Kosman. In the second of the voicemails, she said that she thought her husband was trying to kill her. At the time of the second voicemail, Kosman was away, but he did get back to her as soon as he returned. Julie later told him over the phone that she had given a letter to her neighbor and a roll of film of pictures of her husband's work planner. She ended up retrieving the film and giving it to the officer on this visit. She also said that if she was found dead, she did not commit suicide and that her husband, Mark, should be the first suspect. Later detectives would not find the evidence in the planner that connected to the photos. She also made similar statements to her neighbors and her son's teacher about fearing for her life and that her husband might try and kill her. The neighbor also said that she'd talked to Julie on December 2nd, that Julie had talked about not feeling well. An autopsy was done, but it initially did not have a confirmed cause of death. Law enforcement ordered a second autopsy, and this one put the cause of death as ethylene glycol poisoning, the primary ingredient in antifreeze. The expert also noted that her body showed evidence that she might have been suffocated. The first toxicology report said that she had excessive amounts of ethylene glycol in her stomach, and the second one said it was less than a teaspoon. Despite the inconsistencies, a lethal dose of antifreeze would be about 2 ounces of liquid. 5 months after Julie's death, in April 1999, Mark was questioned by detectives. Given the allegations made by Julie, it is unclear why questioning took this long.
What happened here?
Oh,
I did not do anything to hurt her. There was a question between myself and the kids that morning whether or not to call an ambulance. Her breathing was funny. She could hardly get out of bed. I mean, it was a god-awful situation.
Here in your statement, Wednesday, December 3rd, Julie Lee could hardly move. Here 9 p.m. told me that she was fine and she wanted to commit suicide. And on Wednesday morning, Julie asked me not to call anyone, meaning not to call her help. She wanted to die, right?
Yeah.
So on Wednesday morning,
she asked me not to call anybody.
she's pretty bad off. Wednesday
She
morning.
wasn't looking good. She couldn't. No motor control.
Should you call the rescue squad that Wednesday, you think? She was bad off enough to where she should have called the rescue squad, but she didn't want you to.
She didn't want me to. Well, right, I should have. In hindsight, I know that.
So you didn't do anything to aid in her death, but you didn't do anything to stop her from dying.
I really didn't. I mean, I just watched it happen.
Are you up to looking at some pictures of her? I can grab them real quick. Okay. Show you where the position she was in there, and maybe you could explain it a little bit further.
I've got the image in my mind.
Okay. It'll take me just a minute though. Okay. Let me bring back in the photos and I'll show you. See, like here's a picture of Julie, and you can see here. Look at the nose, how it's bent, like it was pushed into the pillow, like somebody pushed it in there. I don't know how to explain that, Mark. You know, here's probably a better. See how I mean, that's almost looks like it's broken. I have Dr. Chambliss's report right here, which says it's basically an asphyxia death. She's suffocated. And the only way you can suffocate, Mark, is if you did something to her. A 41-year-old young female does just not stop breathing. You had to do something, Mark. Be honest with me. Be straight with me, Mark. Be a man. Tell me what happened here.
Nothing more than what I told you.
You didn't get on top of her?
No.
Well, the evidence suggests is that there was a pillow over her head. If you recall, you saw the nose, same as I did. I got pictures of it.
Right.
Okay? You saw the nose and put a pillow over her head.
No.
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 Mark, how did she stop breathing, Mark? Be straight with me. Be honest.
When I found her,
Mark, you had to do something.
I did not know.
How can I?
Honestly,
how can you explain this?
I don't know.
I don't know. Well, let's get back here to Julie. I mean, here, we'll look at it where you're sitting from my position here, Mark. Okay. One, we have a marriage that was not good.
Right.
Okay, that was not good. You basically has a girlfriend at this point, the one that you were seeing before Julie. Okay. I've talked to some of Julie's friends, and they said she was divorced was mentioned. Some of this other stuff. You guys were not having a good marriage. Okay.
I never.
You know, she contacts us a couple days before, and she leaves us this letter. Okay. Then all of a sudden, boom, she turns up dead. You know, I'm not making this up. This is true evidence. And here we have Julie Jensen telling me that if she dies, you're the person that did it. If anything happens to me, he would be my first suspect. I know he's never forgiven me for the brief affair I had with that creep 7 years ago. I have been doing this 15 years, Mark, and I've never had anybody leave me a letter telling me that if they die, it's this person that killed me.
He was asked by detectives to walk through the last couple days before he found his wife. He said that he had regrets about not calling an ambulance for Julie when she had complained of having difficulties breathing. He said on December 3rd he discovered Julie unable to get out of bed and having difficulty walking. He told law enforcement that Julie had talked to him about her desires to end her life. Law enforcement pressed him on why he didn't do anything to help his wife. He told them, quote, "I just watched her die." Detectives showed him photos of Julie's nose at the crime scene and noticed that it appeared to be bent. They told Mark their theory that someone had used a pillow to suffocate Julie to death. Mark claimed that it wasn't what had happened and continued to say he didn't do anything to his wife. Detectives also discovered that at the time of Julie's death, Mark was having an affair with a co-worker. Immediately after Julie's funeral, Mark sold their house and moved. By November 1999, it was discovered that Mark and his mistress were living together. They later got engaged in February 2002, and they would go on to get married and have a child together. On March 19, 2002, Mark Jensen was arrested and charged with intentional homicide of the first degree. At this time, he did not make bail and remained in jail while he awaited further court proceedings. This would be the start of a lengthy legal battle. Between April and May of 2002, witnesses would testify at pretrial about the letter and conversations that they had with Julie about her fears of being killed by her husband. In June 2002, Mark pleaded not guilty. In September 2002, the bond would eventually be reduced for Mark, and he would make bail, requiring him to make regular check-ins with authorities. Next, the prosecution and defense would fight about whether the letter and witness statements could be entered in as evidence. This started in June 2003 when George Schroeder, the judge assigned to the case, said the letter and statements could be entered into evidence. In May 2004, the defense asked the judge to reconsider his ruling, and in June, he would remove the letter from evidence but keep the witness statements. In September, the prosecution would appeal to allow the letter. The issue would be moved to the state Supreme Court in 2005. In January 2006, lawyers for both sides were allowed to give oral arguments to the court. By February 2007, the state Supreme Court ruled that the letter and statements were admissible if the judge believed that Mark was the reason Julie could not be there to be cross-examined under the forfeiture for wrongdoing, which is the exception to a defendant's Sixth Amendment right to confront the witness against him. There was a preliminary hearing, and in April 2007, the trial judge made the decision that the letter and statements were admissible for trial. On January 7, 2008, almost 10 years after the death of Julie Jensen, Mark Jensen's trial would start. The big question, was it murder or was it suicide? The prosecution would argue that Mark Jensen killed his wife so that he could be with his mistress, that he slowly poisoned her, and when that was not working fast enough, he suffocated her on December 3rd. The defense would argue that Julie had been depressed, and when she found out about the affair, she got so upset and angry, she set up Mark and committed suicide, that Julie had used the letter and all of the conversations she had before her death to frame Mark for her murder. The neighbors and the son's teacher took the stand. They talked about how fearful Julie had been, and the letter was also introduced into evidence. And the man that Julie had mentioned in her letter that she'd had a brief affair with was also brought in to testify. He talked about the brief relationship that happened in 1991, and it had permanently affected Mark and Julie's marriage, and that Mark put illicit pictures from the affair around the Jensen home for years afterward. The prosecution suggested Mark may have done it as a way of torturing his wife. Evidence was also brought forward from the family computer, showing internet searches for ethylene glycol poisoning as well as other ways to kill his wife. The defense argued that it was Julie who did this research so that she could frame her husband. Two sets of medical professionals were brought in, one for the defense saying that it could be suicide, and the other for the prosecution saying that she was asphyxiated and poisoned. Julie's doctor also testified that she had been frantic before her death, and the defense brought in a psychiatrist who would later testify that she was likely depressed and committed suicide. A witness who was incarcerated with Mark while he was being held in custody also came forward and said that Mark had talked about how he had suffocated his wife. A co-worker of Mark would also testify that Mark was talking about killing his wife. The co-worker had not previously come forward as Mark had been his boss at the time. Mark's new wife was also called to testify. She was called to talk about conversations she had with Mark via email during the months leading up to Julie's death, and about their relationship that followed. about Mark's obsession with knowing about past partners and how he could research them online. The prosecution would argue that Mark was quite good with computers. February 19, 2008, the jury started deliberating, and on the 21st, the jury convicted Mark Jensen for the murder of Julie Jensen. A week later, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 2009, Mark and his second wife got a divorce. Mark's defense attorneys started working on appeals almost immediately after the trial. They would eventually get some success in 2013 when a judge overturned the conviction and said that Mark must be released within 90 days or a new trial set. The appeal highlighted that Mark's Sixth Amendment right had been violated during his trial, and how the letter should never have been allowed to be brought into evidence, and that Mark did not get a fair trial under the law. By 2015, the Seventh Court of Appeal would uphold the judge's reversal of the conviction, saying that Mark's rights had been violated. The law previously used to allow the letter in as evidence was for if the express intent was to keep a witness from testifying, not if they were the cause of them not being able to testify. At this point, the state made an announcement of its intent to retry Mark Jensen. But in 2017, the judge, taking the state's arguments, would reinstate his conviction. In 2021, Mark's conviction would be overturned for a second time, for the same reasons as in 2015. A second trial would be ordered, and the courts were in agreement that Mark Jensen's rights had been violated over the admission of Julie's letter as evidence. At this time, he was unable to be released as he could not make the hefty bail. This trial started in January 2023, but the letter would not be allowed into evidence this time. Mark Jensen, now 63, could be seen using a hearing device during the trial. Some of the witnesses previously called had passed away since the last trial 15 years earlier. Their statements would be brought in through past trial videos if they did not involve the letter or the statements. So many years had gone by since Julie's death, and the evidence in the case could only get worse with time. The prosecutors and the defense argued similarly to the first trial. His son David testified, now 33 years old, and was asked to remember what happened the day of and the days before his mother had died. His now ex-wife also testified at the second trial. Friends and family of Julie also testified to her character and how much she was loved. One of her brothers, Paul Griffin, testified that he suspected Mark from the beginning. The trial concluded and the jury deliberations started on January 31st. By February 1st, 2023, the jury convicted Mark Jensen for the second time for his wife's murder in 1998. Mark listened to the verdict with little emotion and was immediately remanded into custody and escorted from the courtroom. A sentencing hearing has been set for mid-April of this year. Mark Jensen always maintained his innocence. His sons also believe in their father's innocence. Julie's brothers are glad for the outcome, and after all this time, she has justice.
Brothers clutched pictures of their beloved sister as they took the podium.
It was very frustrating. There was a lot of waiting, but on the other hand, we always felt a high level of confidence.
For 9 years, they say they held on to hope Mark Jensen would be convicted in their sister Julie's death.
Julie's letter we took it as a mandate.
They say the letter Julie left for police, pointing the finger at her husband, kept them pressing on, but the journey hasn't been easy.
It's been 9 years of putting off emotions, and the first week, second week in court, it was experiencing her death all over again.
But finally, some peace for Julie's family.
I feel, I don't know if closure is the right word, but I feel a emotional sense of rest.
It's not just a verdict. It's the simple truth.
An ending to the story of a mother killed, a story these men hope resonates to so many others.
We hope the story of Julie's story gives hope and courage to victims of domestic abuse.
She's not coming back, but the way she can live is in her story, in our thoughts.
After 25 years, multiple appeals, reversals, 2 trials, and a fair trial, Mark Jensen got the same resulted conviction of first-degree murder. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 3 more recently solved cold cases. Let's get into it. Number 3, Rachel Sendejas and Lisa Kondak. On January 18, 1981, 20-year-old Rachel Sendejas returned home in Camarillo, California from a nightclub called Old Huntington's near Wagon Wheel Junction. She then drove her babysitter home around 4 a.m. and never returned home. Paper carriers found Rachel the next day in the carport near her apartment. She had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled.
Based on the evidence left at the scene, investigators believe that Rachel was accosted as she got out of her vehicle.
Rachel Sendejas had recently moved her 2 young daughters, Eva, 2 years old, and Monica, a year old, in with her brother, Roy Rodriguez. She had dropped out of high school when she was pregnant with her first child and had recently separated from her husband. She had just started school at Oxnard College, taking a job training courses, a federally funded course designed to help homemakers who find themselves in sudden need of a job. Police had no leads, no witnesses, and no known motive. The husband had been cleared quickly, and the case went cold and had no answers. Rachel's brother called the Ventura County Sheriff's Office every year on his sister's death anniversary, begging for answers. On December 12, 1981, at around 3 a.m., a fire was reported in an apartment building near the 1200 block of West Gonzalez Road in Oxnard, California. The fire department responded, and they found that a fire had started in the living room of an apartment that was deliberately set. They were shocked when they found the body of a young woman naked in the bathtub. The woman was identified as the owner of the apartment, Lisa Kondak. She had been strangled to death. Police believe that the fire was set to hide the crime, and only matches were used to start the fire.
Lisa's cause of death is being that of strangulation and suffocation.
Lisa Kondak, 21, had gone dancing at Old Huntington's nightclub near Wagon Wheel Junction the night before the fire. Originally from Connecticut, she had moved to Oxnard after coming to California to visit a friend and decided to stay. She got her apartment and was working in retail at a nearby mall. When police started to investigate, they discovered that neighbors of Lisa had heard screams for help, but no one had called 911 or gotten involved. None of these neighbors had seen who had come in or left the apartment that night. Again, there were no witnesses and no leads. In 2004, law enforcement would get their first new lead from these cases. With advances in DNA not available in 1981, they were able to connect the murder of Rachel and Lisa to one assailant, and they now knew the same person killed both of these women. Unfortunately, this didn't lead to anything new, even when they tested federal and state DNA databases, and the case would eventually go cold again. In December of 2019, Ventura County Cold Case Unit decided to look into genetic genealogy, a process used to find relatives of suspects through public DNA sites. Law enforcement has not commented on the exact steps the investigation took, but in 2023 they arrested their first suspect, 68-year-old Tony Garcia. A fresh DNA sample was taken from Garcia, which matched the DNA found on both victims. Tony Garcia lived only a few miles from both crime scenes. At the time, he was in the U.S. Navy before retiring and becoming a karate instructor. They don't know if he had frequented the nightclub both victims had been at the night before they'd been killed. In a press conference, a sheriff is quoted as saying, quote, "The fact is, this suspect has been hiding in plain sight for over 40 years. Law enforcement is still looking for information on Tony Garcia and are asking anyone who knew him around 1981 to come forward. After 42 years of waiting, Roy Rodriguez and his 2 nieces, who both now work as nurses, have some answers. They got the call that Rachel's killer was now in police custody. Roy never stopped asking and hoping for answers about what had happened to Rachel, and he never gave up seeking justice for his beloved sister.
The long arm of the law has brought justice to the Gondak and Zendejas families.
Number 2, Laurel Mitchell. It was on Wednesday, August 6, 1975, when 17-year-old Laurel Mitchell left work at 10 p.m. at the Epsworth Forest Church Camp in North Webster Lake in Kosciuszko County, Indiana. A co-worker had offered her a ride home, but she said she was going to visit friends at the Adventureland amusement park and would walk, but she never arrived. Laurel also never made it home for curfew. Her parents would report her missing early the following day. Hours later, 2 fishermen found Laurel Mitchell's body in a river 17 miles northeast of the North Webster Lake. An autopsy would show that she died from drowning, and it was initially thought to have been an accident, but a further examination of her body showed that she had several injuries consistent with defensive marks, indicating Laurel fought for her life. Her case was then investigated as a homicide. Experts at the time had believed she might have been sexually assaulted, but the evidence was inconclusive. A witness remembers seeing a 1970s Buick Oldsmobile in the area the night Laurel went missing. Authorities over multiple jurisdictions would spend hours, months, and years investigating Laurel Mitchell's murder. They would interview more than 1,000 people hoping to find out anything about what had happened to Laurel, but in the end, her case would go cold. Detectives never stopped looking. More than 40 years later, in 2014, the police asked the public for help locating a singing group that had stopped into a local firehouse, thinking that they may have seen Laurel. Unfortunately, that lead did not pan out. In 2013, an informant came forward saying that a man named John Wayne Lehman had admitted to him that he committed a crime with his friend Fred Bandy. The details were consistent with Laurel's case. In 2014, another person would come forward saying Bandy had claimed to have committed a crime that happened at Mallard's Roost, a public access site adjacent to the location where Laurel's body had been found. In 2019, they got a tip reported that this person had been at a high school party years ago when Bandy had said that he and Lehman had committed the murder of Laurel Mitchell together. Also in 2019, police resubmitted Laurel's clothing to be tested. In 2020, they would find foreign male DNA from the clothing.
Genealogy has changed the game investigatively. That's since approximately 2015 when the first case ever occurred. That has changed the game.
In 2022, a sample was taken from Bandy, and in 2023, law enforcement discovered it was a match to the unknown DNA sample found on Laurel's clothing. They also discovered that in 1975, Bandy owned a 1971 Buick Oldsmobile. On February 6, 2023, both Fred Bandy and John Wayne Lehman, both 67 now, were arrested on 1 count of first-degree murder. They were arrested in their respective homes without incident and are now being held without bail. It is believed that both men had picked up Laurel, offering her a ride in the Oldsmobile car, where they then took her to the river and drowned her. At this time, the motive is unclear. It is also unclear if either of these men had a criminal history or if there might be other victims. However, after 47 years, the family of Laurel Mitchell has some answers.
I just always wondered, how she would have turned out. And she got, she missed prom, she missed graduation, she missed getting married and having kids. And I didn't have anybody to share all that with, anybody to get, information, help me grow up.
In a press conference, Noble County Prosecutor Jim Mowry said in a statement,
"Well, the arrest of these individuals is an important step in this process. It is just a step, and this is not the end. This is just the beginning of the prosecution."
Number 1, Opal Wheel. On February 9, 1987, in St. Petersburg, Florida, 82-year-old Opal Wheel was found deceased in her bedroom. Mrs. Wheel's sister-in-law had come over that morning after she had not answered her phone. Mrs. Wheel, a widower, lived alone, but her brother and his wife lived close by, and the family was incredibly close. When her sister-in-law arrived, she peeked through the window and noticed that the nightlight in the kitchen was still on, which was odd because she knew Opal always turned it off right away when she woke up at 6 a.m. Further examination of the exterior of the home, and she noticed one of the window panes was missing from the glass in the front door. It was then that she called the police. When they arrived, Opal was found in her bedroom unresponsive. But even with only a cursory glance, officers on the scene could see that there were apparent and visible signs of trauma on Mrs. Wheel, which included severe bruising around her neck, mouth, and face. Opal Wheel was last seen alive around 12 hours earlier. Those closest to Opal described her as tall, slim, always well-dressed, a kind woman who often went on morning and afternoon walks with a few ladies from the neighborhood. Known to stop by and have a friendly chat, her brother and his wife lived a few doors down from her. Investigators discovered that the suspect had entered the house by removing a window pane and that the phone line had been cut. The forensic team used vacuums and other means back in 1987 to collect evidence and were able to collect some foreign hairs at the time. The autopsy showed that she died from strangulation and blunt force trauma. She was discovered in her bedroom in her nightgown. Neighbors were interviewed, some saying that they heard a noise and investigated outside their homes but didn't see anything. The neighbor that was behind her house reported that his dog didn't make a noise that night and would have barked if someone had been in her backyard. Some drawers in her bedroom appeared to have been quickly rummaged through. Some small jewelry items were stolen, which included her wedding ring. Robbery may have been the primary motivation. Perhaps Opal woke up when she heard noises and was killed as a result. After months of investigation with no leads, the case went cold. They didn't give up, and throughout the continued investigation, they eventually got a partial DNA profile from the evidence found at the scene. They didn't find a match until recently. In 2020, the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office cold case detectives contacted the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for additional testing on the evidence. They also contacted Parabon Nanolabs, known for their genetic testing. Throughout the extensive testing, Parabon Nanolabs was able to help build family trees. Detectives were able to find relatives, and the lab was able to narrow it down to 3 possible suspects. After an extensive investigation, detectives were able to eliminate 2 of the suspects, leaving only 1. The primary suspect was discovered to have lived only half a mile from Opal Wheel at the time of the murder. Michael Lapnewski Jr. was identified as this possible suspect. He is currently living in Waveland, Mississippi. In 2022, Pinellas County detectives traveled to Mississippi to do further investigation. They did some undercover work in the hopes of getting a DNA profile. They did this in 2 ways. In July 2022, they followed Lapnewski into a gas station, and they watched him open a straw, stir his coffee, and suck off the coffee from the straw, throw it in the trash. They then collected that straw, and they did this several times. The second was a local detective who owned a restaurant and knew Lapnewski personally, and they offered to allow detectives to put a flyer on Lapnewski's car for a free meal at a specific time and day with proof of residency as some promotion to get people to come to the restaurant. Lapnewski showed up, ate his free meal, and left, and his utensils were saved. The straws and the utensils were tested, and his DNA matched the DNA from hairs found at the crime scene. 55-year-old Michael Lapnewski was arrested in Mississippi on January 26 and extradited to Pinellas County, where he is being charged with first-degree murder. Detectives interviewed him, and he denied being around Opal Wheel's house at the time of the murder, and he said that he did not recognize the victim from an old photo. At the time of the murder, he lived only a few blocks from Mrs. Wheel and had moved soon after the murder. The Pinellas County Sheriff's Office said the investigation is ongoing. Lapnewski was booked into the Pinellas County Jail on January 31, 2023. No bond has been set at this time as he awaits trial.
As for Opal's family,
our family never gave up hope.
They say they're so grateful for the detectives' hard work, and Tracy hopes her mother gets her dying wish and that her aunt finally gets justice.
After 36 years, he's been able to walk this earth. He's been able to breathe air, something my aunt did not have the luxury of doing. And I hope that he is man enough to stand up and to confess to what he's done.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 3 recently solved cold cases in Canada. Let's get into it. Number 3, Muriel Mann. On March 6, 1984, 50-year-old Muriel Mann's body was discovered in a freezer in her home in Gondola Point in Kings County, New Brunswick, Canada. 2 friends had gone over to her home to check on her after not hearing from her for a few days, which was unusual, and they were the ones that found Muriel's body in the freezer. Muriel was a widower, a mother of 4, and a retired nurse. She was described as a strong woman, generous, and warm. Her cause of death was determined to be a blunt force trauma, which had caused a skull fracture. Her death was ruled a homicide. Muriel, at the time of her murder, was dating John Maven, who had been reported to be one of the friends as well as a neighbor who had gone to find Muriel. There had been some speculation that John Maven was a suspect over the years. Very little information is available today on what happened after the discovery, and her case eventually went cold. On March 30th, 2022, the Kennebeckaise Regional Police Force put out a press release. The KRPF talked on the historical homicide of Muriel Mann. She was discovered murdered in a deep freezer. In this release, they said that they had received new information from an anonymous tip from the public that made them reopen Muriel's cold case. After examining the information, they discovered new suspects. They also confirmed that John Maven was not a suspect in Muriel's homicide. John died in 2005. However, his daughter was told by police that her father was no longer a suspect. The dark cloud over the family finally lifted. Police had never formally accused John Maven of the crime. John eventually fled Canada after receiving multiple death threats from the community. He relocated to Paris, France, where he remained until he passed. Law enforcement believed that Muriel was killed because she had learned someone close to her was committing criminal acts, and that she was murdered so she could not go to the police. Her children were informed of the police findings and have been reported never to have been suspects themselves. Law enforcement said that with the 38 years that had passed since Muriel's murder, all the people involved are now deceased. They said in a press conference, quote, "We will never be given the opportunity to validate our findings in court. Our investigation is now complete and the file is closed. And out of respect of all parties concerned, they will give no further details." Number 2, Ljubica Topic. On the evening of May 14, 1971, 6-year-old girl Ljubica Topic and her 8-year-old brother were playing with some children in an abandoned lot behind their home in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, when a man came from a restaurant across the street and approached the group of kids. He offered Ljubica $8 to do a job for him. This was the equivalent of about $60 Canadian today. And he also gave her brother a dime and said to go play with your bike. Her brother had said that that was the last time he saw her when the man offered her his hand and she took it, walking off in the other direction. After that, her brother went straight home to tell his mother about what had happened. Ljubica's mother went straight to the abandoned lot, but by the time she arrived, there was no sign of her or the man. Her mother immediately started looking for her. She had stopped a police officer and said that her daughter was missing. Very quickly after that, over 150 volunteers and law enforcement were on the streets looking for the 6-year-old. At about 1 a.m. on May 15th, Approximately 4 hours after the search had started, an officer found Lubitsa by a garage in the backyard of a house only a few blocks from her home. Lubitsa had been violently beaten, her right leg was broken, and she'd been sexually assaulted. Police collected evidence from the scene, which included some of Lubitsa's teeth and an adult tooth. Other DNA evidence was collected at this time, which was unheard of and very forward-thinking of the forensic team at the time. Investigators reported that she'd been attacked and killed about an hour after she'd been abducted. Newspapers across the country reported about Lubitsa's murder in the days following. Police reported in 1971 they were looking for a man in his 20s, about 6 feet tall with a brush cut, wearing a zipper jacket and dark trousers. The description is based on what the brother told authorities. During the initial investigation, police asked the public for any information on this unique couple and if anyone had seen the girl or the man, as well as after, as the man would have been covered in blood. Police fielded hundreds of leads all across Canada. Even a reward for information would get to a total of $11,000, but would never bring substantial leads. Weeks, months, and years went by, and Lubitsa's case went cold. In the next 4 decades, police would get over 700 persons of interest, but none of them made it to suspect. Over the years, they tested DNA from the crime scene with nothing coming from those tests. In 2015, they would tie several pieces of DNA to one person, but they still didn't get any hits on who that person was. 2015 was also when law enforcement released the information about the adult tooth to the public for the first time in the hopes that someone might come forward about the case. Eventually, DNA and forensics would advance. With the evidence collected all those years ago, authorities were able to use DNA and science called phenotyping to get an idea of what the suspect had looked like. Windsor police eventually turned to genetic genealogy, and they reached out to the US company Parabon Nanolabs to see if they could find any relatives related to the DNA. Websites like GEDmatch or Ancestry.com allow you to say whether authorities can use your genetic information. With that, they were able to find distant relations all over Canada, the US, and Europe. Investigators then worked back to build family trees, then forward with the genetic similarities and regions. Eventually, they narrowed it down to a small group, and investigators were able to get authorization to get DNA samples from this small group to rule out. Eventually, they were able to identify a single suspect. In December 2019, the Windsor police announced that they had identified the suspect in Lubitsa's case. They would announce the man had died earlier that year, in February 2019. They would not release his name to the press, saying it was a violation of his rights as the man was deceased. Since the man was already deceased, they had used saved tissue samples to match the DNA to the original DNA from the crime scene and found it was an exact match, but didn't release why there was a saved tissue sample from this suspect. Windsor police did inform the Topich family and have since asked for privacy, not giving any comments to the media. This isn't the end of this case, though. The Windsor Star would fight a freedom of information battle that would drag on for more than 3 years to get the name of the suspect released to the public. In February 2023, the Windsor Star released the name of the assailant, Frank Arthur Hall, who was 70 years old when he died. Lubitsa may not be his only victim, and they hope that releasing the name helped to solve other unsolved crimes. Frank Arthur Hall was 22 when Lubitsa was murdered. He lived approximately 2 kilometers down the road from the Topich family. He eventually moved from Ontario to Edmonton, Canada, where he lived until he died. After more than 50 years, Lubitsa's case is closed, with her family and community getting answers about who committed such a horrific crime.
This is a case that really shook and rattled the community here in Windsor in southwestern Ontario back in 1971. We're talking about a 6-year-old girl, Lubika Topik, and she was just playing outside of her home with her brother at the time around dusk, and her brother stepped away. Police said a stranger approached her, lured her away, and offered her some money, and that was really the last anyone had seen of her. And it wasn't until police started searching for her, there was a massive response with officers and members of the community as well. And later that night, police say an officer did find her outside and she was sexually assaulted and murdered. And police say that 5 decades went by without any real substance to allow them to make an arrest in this case. Hundreds of tips from all over this country and the United States. And it wasn't until 2019 that police say they believe they identified the person responsible for this, and that was because of DNA advancements. And there were more than 500 persons of interest in this case, but they say they believe that this person was the one who committed these crimes. And at the time, though, in 2019, they wouldn't identify this person. They said they were deceased, they wouldn't have their day in court, and that really outraged a lot of people in this community who thought the identity of this person should be made public. And it wasn't until late last night that Windsor police sent out a news release identifying the person in this case believed to have killed 6-year-old in Windsor as Frank Arthur Hall. Police say he was 22 years old at the time and lived nearby, but later in his life moved to Edmonton, where he died at the age of 70 in 2019. Now, you may be wondering why all of this is coming out now. Well, police say there was a change in leadership that allowed them to reevaluate why they didn't release the name back in 2019. They also say they want to be fully transparent, and that releasing a photo and a name of the suspect or the person believed to have committed this crime may help them get information from the public for other investigations they're conducting, but they wouldn't elaborate on that. But what they didn't say in the release was that there were freedom of information requests from media outlets, including the CBC, trying to get access to this person who they believe killed and committed such a heinous crime. They said at the time that this would be an unjustified invasion of their privacy, and the deceased no longer posed a threat to public safety. So clearly a change of opinion on that. The name has now been released, and some closure for the family and the community here in Windsor.
Number 1. Ghislaine Potvin. On the morning of April 28, 2000, 19-year-old college student Ghislaine Potvin was discovered deceased in her basement apartment in Jean Carré, Quebec, Canada, about 200 kilometers from Quebec City. She had been found by a friend who had dropped her off at 9:30 p.m. the night before, as Ghislaine had an early morning the next day. After calling several times with no answer, her friend went to her apartment and found the door ajar, lights on, and music playing. She found Ghislaine almost naked and called 911. Ghislaine had been severely beaten and sexually assaulted. She had lived with 2 other female college students at the time, but they were not home at the time of the attack. DNA was collected from the scene, but nothing came up when entered into several major databases. This case would eventually be handed over to Quebec's Major Crime Unit. Eventually, Quebec authorities would tie Ghislaine's case to a case in Quebec City that had happened in July 2000, where a woman was sexually assaulted, severely beaten, and left for dead. This woman survived her attack, though we know little details of the attack due to a court-ordered publication ban put in place to protect this victim's identity. The 2 cases eventually went cold. After decades, the case would be passed down from detective to detective until it ultimately was stored with the Quebec Cold Case Unit. In 2018, they got a massive increase in resources, which were put to reopening the case. Over the years, they came up with a few suspects, all of whom would get cleared one by one through DNA comparison. On October 12, 2022, the Quebec police announced their first case solved after the expansion of their cold case unit in 2018. After 22 years, they had arrested a suspect in the Ghislaine Potvin case. Law enforcement said that they used forensic biology techniques to find the killer, but did not release specific information as to how. The suspect has been identified as 47-year-old Marc-André Grenon of Granby, Quebec. On October 13, 2022, he was charged with first-degree murder, attempted murder, and sexual assault in the 2 cases from 2000, which will be 2 separate cases in court. Law enforcement have released pictures of Grenon through the years, as they are still investigating that there might be more victims out there and that he might be a serial predator. He moved around frequently, and there were large gaps of time when his whereabouts couldn't be accounted for. He also has a lengthy criminal history. Publication ban is keeping much information about his arrest a secret, but some information is slowly coming forward. Shortly after his arrest, they got warrants to search his home and take fingerprints as well as DNA, which matched the DNA found in 2000. This ban still protects how they found Curran as a suspect. He is currently being held in prison while he awaits trial, which is set to start in the spring of 2023. Law enforcement are still investigating the possibility that there may be other victims or open cases that may be tied to Curran. Anyone with information is being asked to contact Crime Stoppers.
A Harris County Sheriff's deputy shoots a man who investigators say was on the run after killing his wife.
An arrest warrant filed in this case reads Trent Pascal hid in the master bathroom shower and ambushed his wife and her mother. He is now formally facing murder charges.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 3 more recently solved cold cases. Let's get into it. Number 3. Casey Lee Johnson. 27-year-old Casey Lee Johnson was described by her partner, Bella Berdinsky, as a sweet and caring person. Bella and Casey were in a relationship and bonded over their transgender identities. Casey worked at a Domino's Pizza in Wilmington, North Carolina, and was by all accounts a valued member of the team. When not working, Casey loved nothing more than to kick back and watch anime on the sofa. In January 2023, Casey disappeared without a trace. Months later, the disturbing truth would finally surface. January 13th, 2023 started as a typical day for Casey and Bella. The two went to work, came home, and readied themselves for a night of anime. At some point that evening, Casey announced that she needed to leave their home in the 1900 block of Trad Court. Casey assured Bella that she'd be gone for an hour, but she never returned. When an hour had passed, Bella started calling Casey, but there was never any answer.
I just wish I would have stopped her from going out that door that day. If I could go back in time and stop that from happening, I would.
Worried, Bella took to the streets of Wilmington to look for her partner. They even began searching in the woods near their home, hoping to find any sign of Casey. Casey's social media was scrutinized, but there was never any activity. Bella eventually reported her partner missing to the Wilmington Police Department, and the search for Casey began. Casey's family was also notified of her disappearance. The LGBTQ+ community of Wilmington banded together and held vigils for Casey's safe return. On January 18, 2023, investigators in Georgia were called to the discovery of a body on the banks of the Savannah River near a sugar refinery. The body showed signs of brutality, and investigators were desperate to uncover the victim's identity. According to reports, it took until April 2023 for the remains to be positively identified as missing 27-year-old Casey Lee Johnson. Months before Casey's remains were discovered, the Wilmington Police Department named a suspect in her disappearance, 26-year-old William Haven Hicks. Investigators believe that William and Casey met on a social media, possibly a dating app, and met on January 13th. Williams was arrested in South Carolina and was being extradited to North Carolina. It is alleged that Casey was held hostage by William and taken to another location before being beaten to death with a hammer. William also stole her purse, ID, and $100 in cash. The Wilmington Police Department noted that William transported her from one place to another, held her hostage for ransom in involuntary servitude, caused serious bodily harm, and terrorized her. William Haven Hicks is currently in custody, and is facing charges of first-degree murder, robbery with a dangerous weapon, and kidnapping. The case is due to be presented to a grand jury in the coming weeks. Casey's sister, Amber, has created a GoFundMe to help with funeral expenses for Casey. Number 2. Trent Pascal. On October 21st, 2020, 48-year-old Trent Pascal recorded a disturbing video that had been made for his daughter and stepson.
I'm so sorry that I've done this. I want you to know that you mean everything to me. I love you too. I love you so much. I love you like you're my own. I didn't choose this. Your mom chose this. She's been cheating on me for a long time. There's an 18-year-old difference in her age. And I knew she was kind of too young, but she's been playing me for a fool. I told her not to mess with me, not to mess with my emotions. Don't play with me. I'm like, why me? My hair's a mess and I look horrible. Oh, sorry. Take these off. I'm so sorry. I don't have better words right now. I'm hurting so bad.
In the video's final moments, Trent can be seen walking into the bathroom and getting into the shower. However, once the camera was off, Trent jumped out in front of his wife, 30-year-old Savannah Pascal, as she was walking into the master bedroom. He shot her several times, with 2 fatal shots being made to her abdomen. Savannah's children were still at school when the entire event unfolded, and Savannah's mother, who was also in the house, managed to escape without injury. Following the shooting, Trent fled their home in La Marquis, Texas, in his gray Chevrolet pickup truck. Savannah's mother ran into the home and called 911. When she arrived in the master bedroom, she found her daughter in a pool of blood. Savannah was taken to the nearest hospital, but she did not survive her injuries. According to reports, a neighbor overheard Trent on the phone with Savannah's aunt as he was fleeing the scene. During the call, Trent confessed to having murdered Savannah.
We've been praying every day, and I mean, we're praying people, and we're praying for their family.
Donald Riddick lives just across the street from Trent and Savannah Pascal. His children played with their children.
Man, it's just a big surprise that to me.
Riddick says he and his wife never saw the couple arguing. That is until the morning of October 21st. After the argument, Trent left and
Savannah went to the neighbor's house to ask for help. Can't believe he would leave something like that, telling his kids how he loved them. How can you love your kids if you're going to kill their mama?
The Harris County Sheriff's Office was dispatched to the scene, and additional officers were sent to track Trent down. Tips and leads were called in minutes after the shooting, and police confronted Trent at a Walmart store on West Road on the I-45 north in Houston. Trent refused to lower his gun when confronted and even threatened to shoot responding officers. In response, Trent was shot several times in the leg, upper body, and arms in order to subdue him. Trent was arrested and taken to the nearest hospital for treatment. Doctors determined that his injuries were not life-threatening, and after spending weeks in the hospital, he was released into the custody of the Harris County Sheriff's Office in late 2020. Trent Pascal was extradited to the Galveston County, where the murder occurred, to face the courts. Disturbingly, Trent was released on a $450,000 bond, with an additional $100,000 bail from the Harris County incident. Law enforcement was supposed to keep a close eye on Trent, but somehow he slipped through the cracks. He failed to show up to a court hearing in December 2020, which failed to raise any alarm bells. In February 2021, officers learned that Trent had picked up a traffic violation, but again, nothing was done. It wasn't until April 2021, when he failed to show up to court again, that authorities realized something was wrong. Trent had been fitted with an ankle monitor that should have kept tabs on him, but Trent was one step ahead of the authorities. Trent had somehow managed to remove the ankle bracelet and went on the run. He visited a Chevrolet dealership during this trip and asked to test drive a Chevy Tahoe. Instead of returning the car, Trent held the salesman at knife point and stole the vehicle. Trent's movements between April 2021 and December 2021 are unknown, and a nationwide manhunt was underway. The U.S. Marshals covered Texas with Trent's wanted photos, hoping that someone had seen him around, but he was long gone. For months, investigators felt that Trent was slipping out of their hands. Then, in December 2021, they received the call they'd been waiting for. A witness called the U.S. Marshals to tell them that they'd seen Trent Pascal living in a van at the Holiday Travel Park in Ocala, Florida. On December 31st, 2021, local authorities cautiously approached the van Trent lived in. They gently knocked on the door, identifying themselves and asking Trent to come out. Moments later, officers heard one gunshot ring out, accompanied by a loud thud. When they made it inside the van, they found the body of Trent Pascal. Trent Pascal will never face justice for what he did, and Savannah's family is now left to pick up the pieces. Number 1. Todd Lampley. The evening of February 27, 2011 felt like any other for 31-year-old Ted Lampley of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Todd, his girlfriend, and another male friend were relaxing at home and watching TV after a long day of work. At around 10 p.m., Todd's girlfriend stepped out of the room to make a phone call, and seconds later Todd was shot through the living room window. The entire house descended into panic, with the residents running and ducking for cover. When the dust had settled slightly, they heard the sound of someone making a getaway in a car. Once Todd's girlfriend and the other residents determined it to be safe, they ran to Todd's side, but it was too late. The attacker had fired 3 shots at Todd, killing him almost instantly. Thankfully, no one else at the scene was injured, and the police were called to the scene. Emergency services confirmed that Todd was deceased, which upgraded the case to a homicide. Investigators immediately began combing through Todd's personal life, looking for anyone with a vendetta against him. At the crime scene, investigators found 3 spent shell casings, a black phone, and bizarrely enough, a sweet potato. Investigators were puzzled at the sweet potato's appearance at the crime scene, but it was processed as evidence nonetheless. Investigators continued to dive into the case, but little clues materialized. No one came forward, and the news shocked everyone. Days after Todd's murder, the gun used in the crime was found in a pond near Ted's home. Whilst the gun matched the casings found at the scene, investigators found it difficult to track the owner. For weeks, the case went cold until forensic analysis took a closer look at the sweet potato found at the scene. Bizarrely, the sweet potato held a DNA profile and was discovered to have been used as a silencer. The DNA was sequenced and run through databases, and amazingly, it came up with a match: Deverous Hampton. At the time of the murder, Hampton was on tag, or wearing an ankle bracelet, and investigators were able to utilize the GPS data to place Hampton at the crime scene. Investigators now had the mammoth task of retrieving a DNA sample from Hampton. Investigators carefully surveilled Hampton and were able to retrieve an item that he'd thrown away. The DNA sample was taken, and investigators confirmed that Deverous Hampton was Todd Lampley's killer. Deverous Hampton was no stranger to local law enforcement, and in 2018 he had appeared before the courts charged with sexual assault of a child and another shooting that did not end in fatalities. Despite the solid DNA evidence against him, the Barnstable County courts and authorities had taken over 12 years to bring Hampton to justice. In early 2023, he was arrested for the murder of Todd Lampley, and the case against him is currently ongoing. The latest hearing was scheduled for April 5th, 2023. Although the outcome of this hearing is currently unknown, investigators would later discover that it wasn't the first time that a sweet potato had been used in commission of a crime. The hit TV show The Wire also used a sweet potato as a silencer, although it is unknown whether this inspired Hampton. Well, that's going to be it for this video. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end. As always, if you want to support the channel, the easiest way is to hit the like button. You can also subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss my next upload. Other ways to support the channel are by joining my Patreon or channel membership. I also have merch, and you'll find all the links in the description, plus a few extras. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter for more. But with that being said, thank you so much for being here and supporting what I do. It is very appreciated. But that's it from me. I'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.